Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight's story, we have a battle between an old rivalry. Before we get into madness, be sure to like and comment the videos and topics so to see the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get into the video.
Welcome back, warriors, to Grimhammer, where the galaxy burns, the corpses are still warm, and the void is always watching. Today, we're diving headfirst into the Siege of Somnore, when Imotekh the Stormlord broke the back of Aeldari's pride and sent Aeldari Starbane home one hand lighter. This is grimdark at full throttle, no mercy, no survivors. You're not just watching, you're part of the strike team. So lock your bolters, sharpen your chain blades, and hit that subscribe button, because here in Grimhammer, the Emperor protects, but only if you earn it. Under a ceiling of starlight that had watched Craftworld Aeldari drift for an age, Aeldari Starbane let the runes fall and listened for the lie they always tried to tell. Each spirit stone clicked against the Wraithbone table, like a knuckle on a sarcophagus lid. They spun, wobbled, settled, and in their pale glows he read a dead world breathing in its sleep. A pattern tasted of old battery wind and rain over metal, a tomb with a sky, a valley like a glass bowl, a gate set in the throat of a caldera where the planet itself exhaled cold. He lifted his hand and felt the skeins tug. In the long chamber, the farseers of Aeldari had raised for augury. Wind chimes made from broken runecasters sang, and the infinity circuit's murmur came up through the floor like blood under skin. He could feel the machine minds of the ancient enemy receding and then pressing close as though the sea itself were deciding whether to drown the shore. He named the place because a name is a nail, Somonor. This spoke at once, quiet enough that the universe had to lean in to hear. A ranger captain stood at the edge of the circle, coal leathers powdered with travel dust. He was a shard of shadow the chamber had forgotten to put away. "You see it," the captain said, as if Starbane had not been seeing it for hours, as if the ghosts had not already whispered it through his marrow. "I see a wound," Starbane said. "I see iron pretending to be bone. I see a gate that is a mouth and teeth behind it, cut for our throats. I see stasis coils that cough and stutter. The tomb is not fully awake, that makes it vulnerable." A captain's smile was a scar that remembered joy. "But that makes it prey." "Prey does not lay labyrinths," Starbane said, and then he let a little heat into his voice. "But yes, we strike before the corpse sits up and asks our names." He should have sent the runes again, should have asked the circuit to sing once more, should have waited for the Seer Council to step down from their far balconies of caution and tradition. But the pattern burned in him with the light of an easy victory. He saw clean lines on a war map. He saw pathways sliding like silk. If he pressed now, while Somonor's stasis fug still clung to its legions, a spearhead could punch the gate, cripple local command nodes, and end the node before it cohered. He tasted triumph, and pride came with it like a necessary drug. "Summon the war host," he said. "We move." A Craftworld answered like a city inhaling. Aspect shrines opened their doors. Exarchs stepped out with eyes like cut obsidian and voices tuned to killing. The hall of the Fire Dragon Shrine moaned with heat as its warriors took up melter lances and mouthed oaths that could burn water. Dark Reapers gathered under banners the color of midnight ash, their missile racks whispering through targeting patterns like rosaries. Guardians filed in squads, bright helms and steady hands, the citizen soldiers that made a craft world more than a rumor. Jetbike pilots laughed hard and mean, and checked grave staters with the touch of gamblers. Wave serpents, falcons, and fire prisms groaned awake on their cradles, engines singing a promise of light made into knives. Vipers were rolled out into the hangars like greyhounds tasting the track. Pathfinders relaced boots and muttered curses at the thought of shining metal that would not stay down when you killed it. One of the guardians, old enough to have sworn off the shrines and returned to the line, spat into his glove and said, I hate those fucking tin carrion. You shoot them apart and they grin and crawl back. I want them pulped. Then aim for the joints and stop talking, his sergeant told him. You are not a Monday key trench dog. But the sergeant's mouth gave away a grin. Even among the quiet of Imotekh, the promise of a clean kill did strange things to discipline. Starbane walked the mustering decks and let the men taste his certainty. He did not dress it as arrogance. He wore it the way a duelist wears balance. This is not a grind, he told a flight of Viper pilots as they strapped on their helms. You cut the arteries and move on. If you are asked to linger, it is a lie. Do not linger, strike and flow. You are knives, not siege towers. One pilot cocked his head. If the gate is not open to the first cut, then we cut again. We have fire dragons to whisper at stubborn locks. We have reapers to peel the overseers off their perches. We have enough fast hulls to make them guess badly until they die of their own miscalculation. He paused, then let the mask shift so they could see a sliver of his human heat. And if something more than a gate waits, you run like good cowards and draw it out into air where I can put it on its back. The ranger captain reappeared without having gone anywhere. My pathfinders want the caldera, he said. You should let them taste the rim before you throw warriors at it. If the metal has laid wires under the stone, my boys will hear them hum. Starbane nodded. Go. Take only those you trust to vanish. No heroics. If the caldera looks like a temple mouth, do not kneel. Mark approaches and observation nests. Mark old heat and new. The tomb will pretend asleep, and it will dream with knives. I want to know where its eyelids twitch. The captain's grin grew teeth. We'll go around its eyelids and slit the fucking tear duct, he said, which in ranger language counted as poetry. In the hours that followed, starships shifted in quiet ballet around the craft world's rim, hulls the color of sea dawn. Warlocks walked among them, speaking to machine spirits the Aeldari had never fully trusted, binding them to will and path and return. In the corridors below, Bonzingers tuned armor and weapon-like instruments. Guardians queued for rune-stamped charge packs and measured blades. The fire dragons loaded melter canisters and quoted from the litanies of unmaking, each word a small fire under the tongue. Dark Reapers adjusted rangefinders with the calm of men who planned to practice patience at homicidal distances. Starbane climbed back to the augury chamber because victory is cheaper when paid for in double-checking. The runes had cooled. He warmed them with the flat of his palm and watched. Again he saw the caldera mouth gaping in the face of a valley that looked like a cracked bowl. He saw the primary gate, its seals tired, sigils like chipped teeth. He saw destroyers taking the high ground and deathmarks hunting the fast and careless. He saw the counterstrokes, and he saw them failing because timing would be his ally. He saw victory strands. The skein twined around his fingers as if trying to marry him. He let himself smile and then banished the smile like an intruder. He was old enough to know that the skein often sweetened poison. A messenger from the far council arrived, lacquered like a prayer box. He bowed the correct degree and no more. The council would know your intention. My intention is to spare us a siege, Starbane said. Somonor's heart stumbles. We drive a spearhead while the pulse is weak. We break the gate before their command can stand up. We cripple their defenders and unname their node. The longer we wait, the more bone fuses to their metal. I will not let that happen. The council worries at the Stormlord who bends storms, the messenger said carefully. They worry also at your certainty. The Stormlord is wind and tricks, Starbane said, and felt the scrape of overconfidence in his throat, even as he spoke. He has teeth, but they bite best when you lean on them. I do not intend to provide my throat. I intend to punch him between the eyes before he decides which weather he wants. The council can delay. It can require additional divinations. It can ask you to share command or widen the circle. The council is far, Starbane said, smiling with no warmth, and I am here. If they wish to walk the rim of Somonor's valley and smell the petrichor in that fucking caldera, they can sail down and join me. Otherwise, they can bless my haste or get out of its way. The messenger dipped his head. The council will provide distant oversight. He did not bother to hide the relief. You have latitude. They ask, humbly, that you do not confuse speed with arrogance. I will confuse nothing, Starbane said, which was very close to a lie. The pathfinders ghosted away from Alatoch's docks like thoughts you were not sure you had. Their ships were little more than knives with engines. They slid down the warp's worn grooves and came out above Somonor under a sky the color of sullen iron. They fell in tight, silent arcs, and the warhost hung behind them like a hand that had not quite made a fist. The caldera was where Starbane had seen it in the runes, and more. The mountains here had taken a bite of the planet and never swallowed. The valley floor was fused glass, where ancient heat had come and gone. The mouth in the cliff face was a wedge of shadow like a wound closed badly. The rangers lay on that glass and tasted the air. They tasted ozone and old grease and a cold that did not belong to wind. They watched dust skirl and resettle in patterns around seams that were not cracks in rock. They marked firing nests along the rim where the stone felt suddenly geometric. They watched for the shimmer of phase teleports and saw only their own breath. One of them, who had carried a long rifle through too many campaigns to pretend at poetry, clicked his vox. It smells like the dead learned how to sweat, he said. The gate is there, the gate is tired, the slopes around it make a nice killing bowl. Any bastard who tries to knife through in the open is going to get shredded. But not if he moves like he means it, the captain replied. We will bleed a little, they will bleed more. Mart every rock that looks like a lie. We will bring the dragons to the mouth and make their lock a memory. Back aboard his flagship, Starbane took the reports and let his mind draw fast, sharp maps. Viper flights would race the rim, strip out high perches and force the enemy to look up. Wave serpents would knife to the mouth behind the screen, throw fire dragons at the gate like sacrament. Dark reapers would box the valley and pluck at anything that tried to fly. Falcons and fire prisms would keep the horizon honest. Guardians would be the spine of the push, tight and mean and ready to become a wall if the metal surprised him. Pathfinders would keep cutting sightlines through the static. Jetbikes would be the knife that he would never stop moving. He weighed contingencies with the cold eye of a butcher counting ribs. If the gate was booby-trapped, he would let the dragons whisper to it until it came apart like old bread. If destroyers tried to make a killing geometry from the rim, the vipers would blind them and the reapers would drive them off like crows. If the enemy pretended to retreat, he would not chase far enough to make himself a gift. Speed and maneuver would be his doctrine, not the slow, patient murder a siege demands. They would not camp under a sky that could be turned against them. They would not give the dead time to remember how to be an army. He felt the skein coil around his ribs and press a thumb just under his heart, where fear lives. The strand still showed victory. He pressed one knuckle into the Wraithburn rail until it creaked. He had seen victory before. He had also seen victory turn at the last step and grin with someone else's teeth. He sent his intention to the Far Council, not as a petition but as a courtesy. The reply came as a thin chime and a single line of approval wrapped in caveat. Proceed with humility. He let himself laugh once, humorless. Humility was a coat he would put on after the kill. For now he needed the brightness of certainty to carry men who bled and would soon bleed more. He walked the hangars again and spoke into the Voxnet, his voice the wire that stitched 1,000 pilots and gunners and blades into one shape. We are the storm that happens before any other storm has time to argue. We are not here to dig, We are not here to trade shells with an ossuary. We are here to cut out a heart before it remembers it can beat. You have trained for slow war. Forget it. You have trained for honor duels. Forget them. This is a raid straight through the throat. You hit what stands. You do not stand to be hit. If a machine sneers at you, break its jaw. If it refuses to die, ruin it until it learns. Someone on a deck below, maybe one of the jet bike fools who loved danger like it owed them money, whooped and cried, "We'll gut the fucking grave and piss in it." Starbane let the laughter ride for a breath and then said, steady and cold, "You will not piss anywhere until I tell you to. You will move when I say move, and you will kill what I point at, and you will come home. This is not a joke. This is a cut. Keep it clean." He closed the channel. He stood alone in the master blister and looked out at the pearl swarm of ships turning nose to the dark. He touched the rune for Somonor on the tactical sphere and felt the skein tug in two directions at once, yes and no, braided like lovers. He chose yes because that is what commanders do when the universe refuses to answer in full sentences. The strike order went out. Engines brightened to the color of Oathfire. The warhost of Imotekh slipped the leash and fell toward the cold planet where a gate yawned in a glass-bowled valley. In the quiet between warp tides, Aeldari Starbane told himself for the last time that the enemy was slow and that he was quick, and that quick knives open slow throats. He told himself that again, as if saying it twice made it truer. He did not look back. A lore reference for context and dates. Siege of Somnore occurred in the 798th year of the 41st millennium. Aeldari Starbane led the Imotekh warhost. Imotekh the Stormlord and Overlord. Zaron are the Necron principles. Imotech's tactics later involve nanoscarabs, flayed ones, immortals, and lichgard. Imotekh came to Somonor inside a walking storm. The void above the world had the dry smell of a tomb waiting for guests, and the pharaoh brought weather with him the way other kings brought banners. Lightning crawled along the flanks of his flagship and whispered down to the waiting tomb like a rumor of old oaths rediscovered. He stood at the observation spine as the planet rolled under his gaze, iron grey and glass-scarred, and he counted the ways it could be made to kill for him. The Mandragora's shine still clung to his memory, the crown world seated like a jewel in the diadem of his reconquest. From that stone, his dynasty pushed outward again, methodical as ice and just as patient. Somonor was not a jewel. It was a hinge. Hinges decided whether doors opened or shut. Hinges were worth attention. The Stormlord gave it. On the surface, Overlord Zaren's court rose like a machine that disliked waking. Tomb servitors clattered along ribbed corridors in obedient panic. Cryptex shaped the light with their staffs and ushered processionals of half-alive systems out of their sulks. Warriors with dust in their joints crawled up from their shelves in stuttering, shame-faced rows. Too many remained snow inside their niches, drift and rhymes settling where there should have been rank and file. The years had chewed his world and spat out husks. Somonor's legions were thin and slow, and their master knew it. Zaren came out of his throne cubiculum with the exact dignity of a blade that had not been honed in a long time. He bowed the degree due to a pharaon of the Imotekh, no more and no less. His voice had the ancient patience of a machine that had seen empires bleed out under its feet. He gave Imotekh the truth because lies wasted more time than they saved. "My legions woke to dust," Zaron said, as the Stormlord's court stepped down onto Somonor's black stone. Too many sarcophagi opened to nothing. Too many minds did not find their way back. We have enough to hold walls, not enough to run down prey in open ground. Imotech's gaze moved past him to the wall of the valley, where the caldera opened a mouth like a wound that had decided to smile. Tenoptech swarms drifted above it, their tiny bodies humming through strata of air and dust, drawing maps of heat and echo and scent. The pharaoh's eyes, were old stars behind a mask that had forgotten how to be a face. He looked at the gate, then at the broken glass plane, then at the surrounding heights where 1,000 clean firing lines could be written in Gauss fire with one order. "A craft world has seen you," Imotekh said. His voice was a blade, sharpened against a whetstone of absolute certainty. "They smelled your weakness and have called it opportunity. Aeldari comes. This is useful." Sauron made a sound that could have been laughter if there were any joy left in him. "Useful is not the word I would have chosen. My scouts speak of a war host. Their farseer is young as we measure such things, and believes speed is a virtue if it is loud enough." "Good," Imotekh said. "Let him come loudly. He has told us he will move quickly. We will let him believe speed will save him when it will only tire him before the knife." He walked the caldera's lip with Zarol and a trio of cryptechs who carried portable horizons inside the crystal heads of their staffs. A lightning grumbled overhead, teasing the edges of a storm that had not yet decided to be born. The ground was still with a stillness that made flesh-born men think of graves. The caldera gate did not think, it waited. Waiting was its most natural act. "Your Toon's heart stumbles," Imotekh said, watching Canoptek's schema unfold in elegant tiers above his palm. "But its bones are perfect. We will make the enemy walk into those bones and mistake them for corridors. Lure them inside. When they feel that they have secured this mouth, we will let it close." "Balatop dogs are already nosing the rim," a cryptech murmured, lenses dilating on a feed no one else could see. "Pathfinders, clinging to the slopes like thoughts you cannot shake. Fast skimmers above the valley, stuttering heat signatures at rhythm intervals." Imotekh nodded once. "They will overreach. They prefer to bleed nothing and take everything. Pride will tell them our retreat is panic. We will show them panic and make sure it looks delicious." On a far ridge, a pair of guardians on jet bikes sketched a curve against the sky and cut their vox to whisper while they scanned the glass. The vox cracked with distance and interference, but the Canoptek augurs picked the words out anyway and filed them like labels on future corpses. "Break the fucking mouth and we go home. Do not stop, do not stand, hit and flow. The farseer wants clean cuts and clean boots." The second pilot laughed, a sound like a child's toy found in a ruin, bright and out of place. "Keep it clean," he said, and pushed the bike down into a breathless dive before remembering discipline and recalling the taut thing that held him alive. Imotekh watched them and did not care. The advanced vanguard spoke its plan too clearly. He turned to his cryptechs, each a different flavor of cruel mind, each a librarian of physics and old hit lists. "We will deny them the sky," he said. "We will deny them paradox and choice. I would call a storm over the valley when I wish to move where they cannot see. It will foul their rune sight and blind their bright machines. While the storm makes them slow with questions, we will unseal the gate and fall back inside as if we are afraid. I will let them win the caldera because I want them to feel what it is to be hunters. Hunters chase. When they chase, they string themselves together in lines I can cut." Sauron looked at the gate and then at the valley floor, which still remembered ancient fire. If the farseer is cautious, he will taste that fear and spit it out. He may stand off and shell. He may force us to walk up into his guns. "He will not," Imotekh said. "Aeldari has come here to make a point, not a crater. Their seer believes the Toon's stasis cough makes us soft under the shell. He believes in speed and elegant murder. He will not choose to become a siege. That is not the song he wants to sing. We will give him his melody, and we will write the harmony that strangles it." The pact was not a ceremony so much as a shape that both kings stepped into because the world around them demanded it. Sauron named his cohorts, and their current strength, truth and weakness welded together without vanity. Imotekh named a new chain of command and did not ask for permission because asking was a form of surrender. Sauron accepted because he was no fool. The banners of Somonor burned in quiet, green fire, then smoothed themselves into Sortek sigils as if they had always been that way. Reserve assignments were made in the language of efficient murder. Immortals were designated for the corridor that would become a killing ground, their Gauss blasters tuned for mass saturation rather than showy precision. The lichgard were reserved like a final word, their shields an iron tide waiting just beyond the moment an enemy believed the tide had ended. Death marks and heavy destroyers would write cruel algebra on the caldera rim and force the vanguard to abandon its neat diagonals. A monolith would be held ready to appear where a path looked safest, an insult in the shape of a door. The flayed ones would climb to the vaulting and cling there like thoughts of knives until the right silence fell. Canoptek scarabs would sleep in vents that were not vents and awaken only when a cryptek's tone told them to boil. A Canoptek controller, a thing of spindled legs and too many eyes, offered a projection of environmental options as if serving tea. Storm density here, resonance girders activated there to deepen echoes and confuse allspecs, heat plumes to mimic failing generators, microquakes in the floor to anger sure feet at the worst moment. The Stormlord chose, with a conductor's hand, his mind moving through possibilities and settling on the configuration that would force Eldar speed to become Eldar impatience, then Eldar mistake, then Eldar death. From the valley rim came the first skirmish noises, the sharp purr of a shuriken cannon tested against rock, the answering cough of a Gauss coil spun up and back down again with contempt. The vipers drew slimming arcs and began to mark their own firing nests in the air. Pathfinders shifted the geometry of their sightlines with the grace of men who wanted to live. Imotekh watched without flinching. He was not a man who hurried to meet noise. A noise should come to him and learn. It had misjudged the size of the room. He turned to Saren and let a fragment of courtesy fall like a coin. Your first loyalty is to your world. Mine is to the dynasty. Those loyalties do not conflict today. You will give me absolute obedience until the Farseer screams. When he does, we will make a calculation. If his scream brings others, we will adjust. Until then, we will teach him the lesson of a door that tastes like victory until it becomes a throat. Saren inclined his head the degree that would not shame him. Somonor will wear Sautek's law until the stars are tired, he said. If I am not on this throne when that day comes, it will not be because I argued. Imotekh's court moved with all the grace and zero of the compassion of a machine that had learned its work long ago and never forgotten. Orders went out along conduits of light. Canoptek filaments tightened and hummed. Quantum seals were primed to fall like glass upon glass, invisible until touched. The monolith hung in a pocket of elsewhere, inhuman patience dripping from the edges of its event horizon. In the deeper halls the immortals stood in perfect rows, with their hands upon weapons that had never been anything else. The lichgard rested the points of their blades on stone and let their minds drift toward the old promise that shieldwork was prayer. Above and through and between everything, nanoscarab hives dozed like a plague that had learned how to pretend it was harmless. The storm on the valley lip was a child prodigy ready to be told it could play. Imotekh lifted one hand and it learned discipline. Clouds pulled themselves together like soldiers remembered to duty. Lightning curled its knuckles and waited. When the Pharaon gave permission, the weather would fall and the Aeldari would think someone angry had come to greet them. Then truth, it would be only mathematics. There was a moment when a viper skimmed too close to the mouth and a lance of gorse reached out of a niche and traced a glowing line along its belly, so near to fatal the pilot tasted his own breath. The pilot spoke into his mask without meaning to, and Canoptek ears ate the words. Fuck that. They are awake. Pull back. Pull back. Do not give them a clean shot. We wait for the Farseer's knife to tell us where to cut. Imotekh smiled without moving any part of his metal face that could be seen. He was content to be called slow by men who would be dead by the end of the day. Speed was a trap for people who loved it. He named the time for the surface engagement to end and the descent to begin, and the time was not now. He let the Eldar feel the edges and find them sharp. He let them believe the retreat of his outer pickets was fear, not theatre. He let them speak comfort to one another on closed channels about how they would open the gate and spill in and not stop. He let the thought grow fat and happy. In the orrery chamber of Somonor's heart, cryptechs watched star maps and probability flows. When Overlord Sauron came to stand beside them, there was no shame left in him, only calculation. If we were whole, he said, I would ride out and erase them in the bowl and be done with it. If you were whole, Imotekh said, they would not have come. Then let them in, Sauron said, half a smile ghosting across a face that was nothing like a face, and yet remembered how to do this one thing. I would like them to see the inside of my house before you make them regret it. They will see, Imotekh said. They will think they understand. They will say to one another that they have us handled. They will tell themselves clean lies while their boots ring on my floor. And then they will learn the Sultek way of ending conversations. He stood with his hands clasped at the small of his back and watched the storm gather over the caldera. He did not hurry. He did not thirst. He was a lesson wearing the shape of a man. He waited for Eldaras Starbane to do what pride and momentum would force him to do, and he considered the quiet pleasure of humbling a seer in front of his own dead. He would leave the Farseer alive later, perhaps. A living herald was often a finer banner than a fallen one. For now, the Farseer was only a knife that had not yet met the whetstone. The first fat drops of charged rain ticked on the glass plane like the fingers of an impatient god. A gate rumbled deep in its chest. Imotekh raised his hand. The storm learned what it was for. The retreat began exactly when the enemy expected it, and exactly as convincingly as it needed to be. The Stormlord turned away and walked into the tomb where patience waited with open arms. He left the mouth open behind him, black and inviting, a promise the Eldar would be eager to kiss. The caldera rim looked like a broken bowl laid out for a god who ate glass. Heat shimmered from the fused plane below, bending light into serpents that writhed over the black mouth where the gate slept. The advanced elements of Imotekh slid into their lines with the grace of memory. Vipers carving lean arcs along the lip, jet bikes knifing the crosswinds to test the air, fire prisms hanging back like patient executioners, falcons prowling for angles, pathfinders pressed flat to rock that hummed with unfriendly lives. A warhost had been promised a shambles. What waited was order. A pulse of green reached up from the far side like a bored god flicking a finger. It did not miss. A jet bike became a bloom of petals made from rider and machine. The rider's helm tore open, and something inside it tried to remember how to be a face before it forgot altogether. The second pilot jinked late, shouted a curse that tasted like metal, and felt the next shot score along his engine belly, a line of sick light carving almost to the heart. He rolled and fought the drop with everything he had, dragged the bike back up, and spat into the mast because spitting was all that kept the fear from latching claws. Death marks, not many, enough. They hunted without hurry, stepping through slivers of shadow as if the world were a door they alone could open, their synaptic optics cutting through heat haze and static like knives through silk. Each shot was a decision. Each decision was fatal. The pathfinders answered, patient and venomous, picking their own lanes through mirage and powder smoke, and the glitter of shuriken shards riding back on the wind. A death mark leaned too long from a basalt fang and had the top of its head erased. It toppled in a slow, arrogant shrug and vanished in a whisk of phase light before it struck the ground. On the high ground beyond the mouth, heavy shapes squatted like blunt predators with long, cruel mouths. Heavy destroyers tracked holes with machine indifference and spoke in lances of Gauss that peeled armor the way fire peels paint. A falcon taking the long way around the bowl tried to hide its intentions in the heat shimmer. Her beam found it anyway and drew a glowing seam from prow to stern that sprouted a forest of molten rivulets. The pilot kept it level long enough for the crew to jump. Then the tank folded in on itself with the tired sigh of a building losing an argument with gravity. A fire prism sent a lance of captured light in answer, drilling a corona into the rock where a destroyer had been a breath before. The target slipped its skin into a waiting beam of recall and reappeared half a ridge away, intact, unashamed, ready to rake again. Pathfinders crawled like thoughtful lizards, faces painted with dust, eyes narrowed against the flicker of bad weather gathering. They learned the rhythm of the Deathmark's breathing and put knives of monofilament silence into that rhythm. They counted heartbeats and broke them. They whispered to one another without romance, a thread of dry humor woven through the cursing because laughter is the cheapest armor you can wear. Watch your edge. The next ridge is lying to you. There's a bastard on the left hoping you forget he exists. Make him regret hope. Aeldari Starbane listened to reports run through the net with the clipped finality of men who could not afford to sound afraid. He stood in the forward blister of his command skimmer, eyes on the bowl, and he felt momentum wanting his hand. The plan was a blade. Blades do not plead. You drive them. He gave orders in a tone that made obedience feel like gravity. Keep the vipers scouring the rim. The reapers scrape those high perches clean and do not stop until you taste metal. Fire dragons hold for the mouth. Guardians stay knotted and mean. We will crack that gate by speed or by fire, and either suits me. A viper pair scissored a Deathmark nest and found themselves answered by destroyer fire that walked their flight in precise, uncaring steps. One pilot's scream cut off when his chest opened under the harness like a second mouth and sprayed the canopy with a red fog that turned black as it dried. His craft yawed, clipped the other's wing, and both slammed the slope in a tangle of panels and fury. The remaining pilot kicked clear, rolled into cover, and hissed through clenched teeth as he bound a leg that was not interested in being a leg anymore. He punched his Vox to private and growled, "Keep fucking moving, or they will make you art." Wave serpents nosed forward in the shadow of falcon hulls, their shields crackling as gorse fire gnawed and was answered. A fire prism took a perfect shot that cut a destroyer in elegant halves, both pieces scudding away like insulted furniture. A phase light swallowed the wreckage before anyone could cheer. That, more than the killing fire, did the morale work. Killing something that refused to stay dead rots the stomach. Guardians began to count under their breath, a habit from other wars. 1 shot, 2, 3, breathe, 1 shot, 2, 3, breathe, and the counting kept their hands steady as the retreat paths they had drawn in their heads pinched narrower. A Necron regeneration and retrieval turned the bowl into a cruel game of cups and seeds. A squad gutted under shuriken hail would flicker and be replaced by the same squad freshly tuned. A quiet fold in reality, carrying damage away to be repaired, while identical bodies stepped forward into the same footprints. A destroyer with a melted flank, vented hate, stepped backward into a shining doorway, and his twin returned pristine to the crest with the same dead gaze and the same patient malice. A Deathmark fell, a Deathmark returned, possibly the same, possibly not. In either case, the scope found another throat. The surface of Somonor became a geometry of denial. The destroyer's arcs crossed into a net that shaved options down to suicide and luck. The Deathmark's cold patience cut the long lines that jet bikes loved, forcing the pilots into choppy sprints that bled advantage every time they restarted. Even the wind seemed convinced of an enemy plan, pushing dust where it most wanted to be, lifting heat in sheets that hid the wrong things and showed others too clearly. The ground had opinions. Those opinions were hostile. Starbane's voice remained iron. Momentum was still a god if you did not let it become a demon. He pressed. He drove the Viper flights harder to worry the high guns, trusting in speed to do what speed always promised. He laid a choir of Reaper rockets along the crenellated rim with the bored brutality of a craftsman sharpening chisels on bone. He drank in casualty numbers and did not let them change his pace. If the gate cracked early, all the pain would be wine. If the gate did not crack, then they would pour more fire into the hinge until it did. A Guardian squad took a step left at the wrong time. Gauss fire carved a clean cut through them, glassing sand into strings under their boots, turning one trooper's torso to transitory light and scattering two more into charred pieces that had the indecency to try to twitch. Their sergeant counted the survivors and found too few. He swore like an old friend and shoved the last man into a hollow with a boot that did not ask nicely. The last man spat, wiped the black from his visor, and laughed because the other option was a scream that would steal his air. Above, destroyers adjusted as if gently correcting a child's spelling. The fire prism shot stitched bright wounds across the ridge and made smoke that smelled of stone and dimensional wrongness. The destroyers did not care about smell. They chewed another falcon until it lost flight and slithered down the slope in a trail of its own melted guts. Pathfinders kept their revenge small and neat, pinging death marks off their perches with shots that made no sound and left no room for argument. One Pathfinder muttered, "You mechanical fuck, show your shoulder again," and when the shoulder showed, he took it through the joint and watched the arm tumble away like a fallen branch. The death mark stepped backward into light and returned whole. The Pathfinder sighed like a disappointed teacher and went looking for a final exam. In the tomb behind the mouth, Imotekh noted figures in a way that would have broken a living mind. Asset attrition lay along one axis, heat load along another, coil stress, phase gate latency, scarab hive readiness, lightning temperament, probability drift, all stitched into a pattern that hummingbird minds called beauty and men called horror. He saw more of his warriors fall than he preferred at this stage. He saw enemy shots he admired. He did not smile. He did not frown. The plan remained sound. The surface was not the argument. The argument would be held below, in a room shaped to receive it. He told himself what he had told Saren. Let them win exactly as much as they need to feel clever. His court relayed minor corrections. A destroyer wing slid 2 ridges east to keep a corridor of fire clean. A deathmark cadre shifted to watch a flight path the Aeldari had not yet thought to use. A canoptech node cooled a coil with a whisper and a prayer to physics. Everything else was patience. Losing a retreat window is like discovering a door was painted on. A vanguard felt it happen when the destroyers knitted a seam across the left flank, and the death marks broke the right into panes of danger so fine you cut yourself just looking. The only safe vectors were down and forward. Down meant the gate. The gate meant the plan. On a Viper channel that had not been meant for command ears, a pilot barked, "Fuck this, we are chewing stone and the stone is chewing back. Give us a proper target and we will carve it." They did not know who he was asking. Eldorath heard it anyway and chose to be the answer. The Farseer's orders fell through the net like a handful of nails. Break for the throat. I have the Stormlord marked on the far ridge, beyond that basalt fang, under the birthing thunder. He is screened, but nothing breathes harder than a king who thinks he smells our blood. We form a strike wedge and drive until he flinches. Viper scream forward, serpents behind, dragons ready to dismount on my mark. Guardians hold the bow line and deny the crawl. Reapers keep the rim honest. Prisms blind the heavy mouths whenever you can steal a clean line. Winds acknowledge. And acknowledgements came back fast and savage because speed was a drug, and these were men who knew how to ride it without dying, usually. The wedge assembled in motion, vipers low and fast, wave serpents with shields shimmering like heat mirages, falcons offering side eyes at any destroyer foolish enough to contest head-on. The bowl drew long lines under them, the mouth big in their forward glass, the ridge beyond it, a jagged smile where the Stormlord had let himself be seen. The wedge's point pilot whispered to no one, "We are coming for you, old machine, and you will blink first." Imotekh felt the shape of the counterstrike, the way a huntsman feels, the wind change. He did not need to be told. Some moves make their own announcements. He saw the wedge begin to right itself on the plane and nodded a degree that meant nothing to anyone but the Plam. He did not rush to meet it. He adjusted one figure, then another, in the quiet, unseen places that make loud gestures fail. His hand hovered over the glyph that would call the slab of living stone from elsewhere into here with the insolent certainty of a door that refuses to open because it is a wall. The sky drank another mouthful of charge and rumbled like a beast promised meat. The gate muttered. The wedge dropped a fraction lower, daring the destroyers to risk blue-on-blue fire into their own path. The pathfinders shifted to watch, to witness, to mark what came next into the part of the soul that remembers and tries to warn you later. Starbane's voice was almost gentle as it came back over the wedge's private band. Keep it clean. Hit hard. Do not fucking stop. If the Stormlord is flesh enough to bleed, we will teach him how. If he is not, we will make him wish he had stayed a rumor. The point pilot grinned without humour and let the engines scream. The warhost's breath came and held. The bowl tilted forward like a goblet about to pour. On a ridge that had never learned the word fear, a king of old storms lifted a single finger, then let it fall. The wedge came on like a promise that had decided to become a threat. The Vipers skimmed the rim with engines screaming in the register where metal loves to die, wave crests of dust rolling beneath their fins. A wave serpent behind them rode the bowl air like it had been born to it, shield veil shimmering, prow hungry for the dark ridge where the Stormlord had let himself be seen. Falcons prowled to either side, fire prisms holding their shots like archers who knew the value of the perfect breath. The Pathfinders flattened to rocks so hot it whispered, rifles nested, eyes narrowed against a heat haze turned treacherous by the promise of storm. Point, keep it clean, came Starbane over the wedge band, almost gentle. If the machine blinks, you cut its eye out. No fucking victory laps. The lead Viper pilot grinned into his mask and dropped lower, a knife blade drawn along the bowl. He saw the basalt fang where the Pharaon silhouette had been a moment before. He saw the neat geometry of firing lanes that his speed would spoil. He saw the mouth of the gate yawning, black as a god's bad idea. He did not see the monolith until the world decided to have it there. It arrived with the obscene casualness of absolute power. A slab of living stone the size of a cathedral door stepping sideways out of, elsewhere into his flight path. There was no warning flash, no theatre, only absence and then presence. The pilot's curse started in one language and ended in another. He hauled the stick over and there was nowhere to go. The Viper hit the corner of that cyclopean block and came apart like a cranked suit of glass. Pilot and machine sorted across the slab in incandescent shards that flashed and went out. The shockwaves slapped the second Viper into a half roll. The wingman fought it like a drowning man marrying a current, barely saved the craft, and went wide with a howl of rage and shame. The monolith did not care. Its particle whip bloomed like a malignant flower, a cone of emerald rage that found the wave serpent by the feel of its arrogance. The first lash stripped the shield veil down to a ragged curtain of fizzy light. The second pinned the grav transport like a bug to felt. The pilot shoved power to the four veins, and the craft skidded in the air, screaming, forced toward the slab that had not existed a heartbeat before. The serpent's prow kissed the monolith with a noise like a bell rung underwater. Hatches blew. Bright figures leapt, fire dragons in ember helms and heat-scarred sigils, and the third lash of the whip did not so much hit them as decide that they were a mistake. What the blast did not vaporize, it threw back in ragdoll arcs. The air filled with glitter that used to be men, and with pieces that tried to remember how to be part of a body before the ground took that away from them. Pathfinders shifted, barely the thickness of a breath. Sight pictures snapped into place through heat shimmer and powder smoke and stabbing green glare. One death mark leaned too long to acquire the smoking wreck where a jetbike rider crawled. The Pathfinder took the head at the neck ring and let the body puzzle over what had gone wrong as it toppled. The corpse broke into phase light before it hit the slope and was gone, replaced a heartbeat later by another of its cast watching the same killing field from a different angle. The Pathfinders did not indulge in curses. They learned the new angles and killed again. On the rim, the Dark Weepers took their patience in both hands and punished. Flight paths blossomed as targeting runes found weight on the soul. Rockets warped the crenellations and peeled destroyers from their perches in bursts of force that turned stone to dust and dust to a fog of knives. A heavy destroyer pivoted to answer and took a volley across the throat that tore the emitter from its housing. It dipped with the wounded dignity of a proud beast, speared through the gills, slid into a fall, and then dissolved into recall glow before it had the decency to crash. The second destroyer of that pair took the opportunity to teach manners to a falcon that had grown bold. Its lance drew a seam through the tank that opened like a smile, crew scrambling from the wound mouth and stumbling into cover with the blind clumsiness of men who suddenly remembered they were breakable. The monolith, beautiful in a way that would make any sane soul sick, turned and dragged the particle whip across the slope again. The beam felt its way toward a cluster of guardians that had crouched behind a rock too small for their number. Half of them vanished where they knelt, reduced to a glitter that kissed their squadmates' visors like black snow, and the survivors hugged the stone and screamed a short, simple prayer to any god that might still be awake. Pathfinders shifted, barely the thickness of a breath. Sight pictures snapped into place through heat shimmer and powder smoke and stabbing green glare. One death mark leaned too long to acquire the smoking wreck where a jetbike rider crawled. The Pathfinder took the head at the neck ring and let the body puzzle over what had gone wrong as it toppled. The corpse broke into phase light before it hit the slope and was gone, replaced a heartbeat later by another of its cast watching the same killing field from a different angle. The Pathfinders did not indulge in curses. They learned the new angles and killed again. On the rim, the Dark Reapers took their patience in both hands and punished. The flight paths blossomed as targeting runes found weight on the soul. Rockets warped the crenellations and peeled destroyers from their perches in bursts of force that turned stone to dust and dust to a fog of knives. A heavy destroyer pivoted to answer and took a volley across the throat that tore the emitter from its housing. It dipped with the wounded dignity of a proud beast speared through the gills, slid into a fall, and then dissolved into recall glow before it had the decency to crash. The second destroyer of that pair took the opportunity to teach manners to a falcon that had grown bold. Its lance drew a seam through the tank that opened like a smile, crew scrambling from the wound mouth and stumbling into cover with the blind clumsiness of men who suddenly remembered they were breakable. The monolith, beautiful in a way that would make any sane soul sick, turned and dragged the particle whip across the slope again. The beam felt its way toward a cluster of guardians that had crouched behind a rock too small for their number. Half of them vanished where they knelt, reduced to a glitter that kissed their squadmates' visors like black snow, and the survivors hugged the stone and screamed a short, simple prayer to any god that might still be awake. The monolith tried to retreat, the way a mountain tries to step backward. Recall nodes flickered and failed, bathing its faces in sick light. It groaned, not loud, but with a weight that made ribs ache to hear it. The Exarch planted one last charge and used his helm as a sight, blackened glass framing the corner where the whip's head housing split. He triggered the canister and bellowed, voice raw, "Break, you sanctimonious bastard." The charge ate into the crack, The crack widened, the whip's heart coughed its insides out in a surge of unlight, and then the slab slumped. One whole face sheared away in a plate the size of a small temple and toppled, smashing itself to rubble in a rain of screaming fragments. The aftershock shoved men to their knees. The dragon stood by will and spite and held their melters level for a shot that was no longer needed. "Door is down," the exarch rasped. "The next fool who teleports it back can kiss my..." The rest went to static as a death mark finally threaded around through his neck seal. He folded as if nodding to a joke. Only he had heard. His squad did not break. An underling snapped the launcher from dead hands and went on giving the world lessons in obedience. For a few breaths, victory flashed its teeth at the wedge. Local air cover climbed from the hole that had been punched in their plan and tried to draw new lines across the bowl. Reapers cleared another shelf of destroyers and silenced a cruel ridge with the rhythm of a metronome that hated. Pathfinders removed the eyes that had been plucking at the wedge's nerves. Falcons, limping and stubborn, laid down suppressive fire that turned rock to chalk and chalk to smoke. Guardians breathed through the taste of vaporized brothers and held the bowl line with the grimness of men who know that if they give an inch, the inch will follow them home and sleep in their beds. Imotekh watched all of it with the stillness of a statue that had learned to think. He counted the losses he was prepared to spend. He allowed himself the luxury of admiring the dragons as a phenomenon. He had always respected craftsmen who brought a perfect tool to a specific sin. He noted the attrition of his destroyers and the tempo of their recall cycle, registered the way the Reapers were thinning the rim into a median of caution rather than confidence. He listened to the patience of his plan. Ask him a question. He answered with a single word that moved nothing on the surface and everything below it. On the rim, the air joined the enemy. Clouds thickened like muscles bunching. Thunder stitched itself through the valley's throat and waited for the right cue to shout. In the bowl, a guardian runner skidded into Starbane's shadow, panting. "We can ride this," the runner began, and then flinched as a glancing gorse stroke etched a bright graze across the craft's prow and turned his next words into a hiss. "We have a hole. If we push now, we can bite the ridge and shake the bastard out." "We push," Starbane said, "or we let them think we are grateful for the door they gave us." He stared at the ruined slab cooling on the slope, at the glitter of burnt souls unlatching from the air, at the elegant lines of his battle plan scrawled in sudden blood. He tasted the old addict's cocktail of victory and price. "We push," he decided, and sent the order. Momentum is a god that demands offerings. He had brought enough. That the board had changed in ways the eye cannot see. The monolith's fall gave ground, yes, but it also affirmed a lesson the Stormlord wanted taught. The enemy would commit to the mouth when invited. Destroyer volleys clawed at the wedge as it reformed and tried to pretend the last minute had not happened. Death marks came back in new positions, colder, smarter, patient as a long knife under a mattress. Reapers burned them out, then burned them out again, then cursed quietly at the glow of recall. The falcons limped with holes where lungs should be, and still shot as if dignified death were a prize to be earned, not a tax to be paid. The dragons, those stubborn saints of unmaking, tried to press beyond the ruin and found the ground itself arguing. The slope under their boots shuddered with a microquake that had no business existing. Heat plumes licked from vents that had been stone. Lines of sight collapsed into angles that made no sense and yet punished like reason. The air grew heavy with charged rain that had not yet fallen. It felt as if the weather had been taught to hate them and had been eager to learn. A Reaper sergeant barked into the net, voice gone rough with smoke. "We are peeling them, but they peel back. We hold this mouth. We can keep flensing the rim." "I need air to stop being a liar." "Air will not oblige," said Starbane, too softly for anyone but the ghosts in his helm to hear. He watched the storm's edge roll in like a bruise. He looked to the ridge where the Pharaon had shown himself earlier and found only absence, which was an answer. He felt the skein tug, yes and no, braided tight as a noose. Below the surface, the Stormlord made his choice with the detachment of a man moving a book from one shelf to another. The surface, though painful, had given him what he wanted. Eldar blood in the bowl, will committed, the wedge convinced that a decisive lunge would purchase a crown. Another monolith could be summoned. Another particle whip could write more obituaries. He could spend immortals and engines here in the open and still win. That the lesson he loved best was not written in the sky. It was written in stone and silence and doors that closed too late. He dismissed a second slab with a negligent thought and let the broken one lie like bait. He told the storm to lower its eyelids. He told the tomb to let out a sigh and open. He told his reserve to wait where only fools and kings enjoyed waiting. Phase 2 was not a flourish. It was a welcome. On the rim, the wedge steadied itself around a gap that looked like grace. Pathfinders called clean lanes. Reapers hammered the last tall guns into submission. The dragons licked molten scars into the edge of the mouth to make it honest. Falcons and serpents breathed, shook, breathed and moved. Starbane lifted his hand, and all the knives aligned out of habit, hunger, and belief. The gate's ancient mechanisms muttered. The valley's first heavy raindrops hit the glass with the slow, deliberate cadence of a drum. The Aeldari told themselves that sometimes the universe did a good deed by accident. Inside the tomb, Imotekh turned and walked deeper, voice a thread to his immortals, and his lichgard to scarabs in their vents, and flayed ones clinging to the vaulting like thoughts of murder. The board had reset itself around the gate, as he had known it would. The surface fight was now a tax paid and a lesson learned. The decisive act would happen where echoes lasted, and doors remembered how to bite. He gestured once, a motion that could have meant farewell or invitation, and the dark answered like a mouth about to close. The sky learned obedience. Clouds rolled in from nowhere and everywhere at once, heavy-bellied and mean, stitched with veins of charge that made teeth ache through the hounds. The lightning crawled sideways like a thought too angry to choose a direction. The bowl that had rung with fire went dim and close, the horizon chewed down to a wolf's grin. The Stormlord called his weather like a bard calls a song, and the song did what it was told. Invisibility went to hell. Auspex screens sulked, then lied, then died, every rune bleeding into the next, until the whole panel looked like a wet prayer. Which side frayed, skeins turning to snarled wool, every thread tugged by invisible fingers. Warlocks tasted metal and ozone, and the old flat stink of the tomb, and swore softly as the patterns they had trusted their long lives slipped in the storm's fist. Pathfinders cursed the way professionals curse, with affection for the enemy who had earned it. The wind became a hand pushing in every direction. The rain arrived in fat, charged drops that bit like little dogs. The gate unsealed while the storm said its piece. No fanfare, no hymn, just a shiver in the stone, and a sigh dragged up from under a continent. Black seam to black mouth. Green light far down where the world remembered how to be a machine. Within that mouth, Necron cohorts fell away step by step, falling back with the etiquette of soldiers who had practiced long after everyone else forgot how. No disorder, no panic. Lines turned, fired, turned again, and vanished down the throat with the indifference of tides. Tanoptech swarms moved like smudges of thought and smoothed the ground where boots had just been, as if erasing a mistake from an exam the universe was marking. Eldrath Starbane watched through rain and static and pride and found only one story worth hearing. Retreat. He tasted the word and found it sweet. The tomb's stasis cough had them by the throat. A king was gambling on whether to disguise a broken line. The Farseer had chased ghosts before. He had also chased prey. This smelled like the latter. He leaned into the command net, and let the new god speak, the god called Go. The voice that came out of him was quiet and iron. We finish this. Down the throat. No fucking camping under a sky that hates us. Advance elements go first and keep momentum like a lover. Main host comes right behind and does not pause to count trophies. Dragons to the mouth. Reapers rake the rim until it stops being brave. Guardians hold the bowline only long enough to fold and follow. Jetbikes and Vipers run the edges for lies and then get scarce. If the Stormlord wants to sprint, we let him until he runs out of corridor. The wedge obeyed, as if pulled by gravity. The advance force plunged, engines snarling under discipline, boots ringing on stone that did not like the weight of anything warm. The Pathfinders slid off the rim and flowed along the glass with the confidence of craftsmen who had already paid for this confidence in blood. The main host rolled forward, as if the craft world itself had leaned on it. The caldera quieted. Not peace, never peace, just quiet, the kind that comes between a punch and the reaction. Gauss echoes scratched the air like distant animals, coupling, brief and ugly, then cut. Thunder spoke in long sentences that meant nothing except that someone old was clearing his throat. Rain ticked on shattered armor and turned black dust into glue. Smoke lay down and had a nap. Pathfinders marked corners out of habit and spite. They chalked the world with touches of wraithbone and broken mica, tiny blazes tucked low where only a brother's eye would catch them. They pointed at seams that looked like cracks, but would be doors if given an excuse. They whispered coordinates without numbers, a language of ridges and teeth, and a scar shaped like a question mark. The one ranger touched the rock and winced. Feels like a corridor under a cloak, he said. The ground is humming. It thinks it is being polite. The storm made everything polite. It took hard edges and rounded them. It took sharp lines and filed them. It took the neat, bright geometry of Aeldari maneuver and smudged it with wet fingers. Still, the net filled with brisk acknowledgements and ugly joy. The enemy was falling back in order, yes, but falling back all the same. You do not seed a mouth if you want to bite again. This was the old song, pressure and collapse, push and knife. The Farseer would not waste what the weather had offered. Imotech's rear guards laid their signs out like gifts, a scatter of dropped coils that looked hurried. Scorched sigils on the wall, as if a beam had raked wild from a panicked shot. Scarab shells crushed into powder in the shape of a stuttered retreat. A recall destroyer left one breath late, letting its ruined chassis slump in the mouth of an alcove where Eldar would see it and say to each other. They ran. A deathmark let a shot swing wide by a lover's finger and stitched a line that meant haste rather than hate. The Stormlord did not need their theatre to fool human eyes. He needed it to whisper to a seer's pride. Starbane took the whisper and made it doctrine. He felt the pull of the skeins snagging on the hooks the storm had set in it, and told himself that certainty was not arrogance, not this time, never this time, because he could taste the enemy's fear under the rain. He spoke into the net. Keep the lanes clean. If a door opens, act like you paid for it. Pathfinders, bless every corner and holler if the floor starts lying. Dragons, kiss any lock that looks pious. Guardians, you are the hinge. You flex or we snap. No stupid heroics. Kill clean or do not kill at all. Inside the mouth, the world narrowed to a single long breath. Walls that had been rock became ribs. Ribs became pillars. Pillars became devices with ideas. The air lost heat in steps, not a slope but a series of drops, each one accompanied by a neat little prickle across the skin. The feeling of walking into a room where someone had been talking about you and stopped. Lighting, such as it was, came in pale green washes and sulking amber pulses, and the occasional cruel spark of white where canoptech filaments did their unnatural embroidery. The first corridors were honest. That was the trick. They gave cover where cover was sensible and angles that made tactical mathematicians nod. The rear guards fell back with that same maddening order, firing only when they could humiliate, never when they could only wound. When they did fire, it was to break a stride, not a neck. A guardian took a glancing thread of gorse to the calf and swore and kept moving, and the shot had been placed by a mind that knew how to make a man limp without making him stop. A jet bike unit tried to nose into a side passage, and a polite field nudged them back into the main artery with the soft insistence of a firm hand on the shoulder. Behind them, on the glass plain, Zaren's local cohorts were doing the arithmetic that made a world live or die. Command lines redrew themselves in light. Teleport grids cooled, then warmed, then cooled. Minds above and below agreeing on who would be allowed to come out if anyone tried to come out early. Somonor's guard legions reformed along exfil routes with a conservatism that tasted like old stone. The Overlord did not waste men, and he was nobody's romantic. He set his house to guard its doors while the invited guests went deeper into the hall. The Stormlord walked where no living boot had any business sounding. He did not stride. He did not stalk. He moved like a solution. Cryptex floated at his shoulder, spines humming, each maintaining a piece of the lie. The tomb was telling its killers. A false echo here, a heat plume there, a whisper of failing field that would promise a breach if only you pressed. He had already planned the room where all this would end. Now he was just making sure the road there was picturesque. A Reaper sergeant paused at a junction and peered through a slit of a visor that always made the world look like an accusation. He did not like what he saw. The ground ahead was too clean. The corners were too generous. He spat and it sizzled, and he did not deign to be impressed. Who touched his bead? If they are fleeing, they are doing it like gentlemen. I would prefer a little fear in the air. This smells like theatre. The reply came in Starbane's voice, clipped but not cruel. Then assume theatre and play your part. Keep the script tight, and if a wall moves, burn it down. Forward. We ride their retreat until it becomes a rout. Pathfinders fanned, marking the turns with touches that would be invisible to a machine and obvious to a brother. A smear of ash where no ash should cling. A notch cut in a resin seam with a blade so thin it was more a thought than a knife. They murmured to each other as men do when the world is too large for silence. This turn lies, that grill breathes. There is a cold where there should be heat. Someone is walking behind us and does not know how to make noise, because noise is for living things, and this someone is not living. One ranger stopped at a wall that remembered it was a door, and it almost remembered how to show that fact. He pressed a palm flat and felt a tremor travel his bones. A whispering buzz came under his glove like a swarm the size of a prayer. He pulled away, shook his hand, and grimaced. "That is not mortared stone," he said. "That is something's idea of a wall. We keep moving while it keeps lying." The rear guards left other gifts. Spent power cells that chimed when kicked, as if to say, "Hurry, I was dropped, chase me." A line of gorse scoring across a bulkhead at a height far too clean to be accidental, suggesting a man running and firing behind him wildly. A glow from a vent that would promise an overheating coil if you believed in happy coincidences. A destroyer's laugh, briefly audible in the storm's lull, cut mid-chuckle by a hiss and a phase flicker like a coward's exit. Every sign was a bruise on discipline. Every sign said, "Come on then, you have them." The main host entered the tomb like rain through a gutter, steady and inevitable. Guardians breathed in, breathed out, set the pace, and did not stumble. Dragons flowed around them, heat held back like a secret they had promised to share at the right time. Reapers rolled their shoulders under weight and let patience guide them, every firing lane a promise. Falcons and serpents came through in staggered beats, engines whispering, shields annoyed by the constant smearing attention of stormborn static. At the mouth of the caldera, the world pretended to be empty. Destroyers on the rim went quiet, coils cooling like snakes in shade. death marks vanished into angles that were not currently useful. The rain thinned as if it had been told to step outside for a smoke and think about its behavior. The valley floor went back to being a bowl of glass and bones and lightning that refused to commit. For a heartbeat, a man on the surface could have believed the battle had gone somewhere else and taken its noise with it. He would have been right, which is not the same as being safe. Starbane felt the change in pressure, as a pressure inside himself. He did not let the feeling put a tremor in his orders. Keep moving. If you stop, you grow roots, and roots die in stone. Every squad marks its own return path. If a door closes, burn a new one. We are not tourists, we are surgeons. Cut and keep walking. Underfoot, the floor shifted, almost imperceptibly, from natural to curated. The stone did not show tool marks because the tools that had made it did not care to leave fingerprints. The cavities yawned at intervals and then decided not to. Bridges unfolded like polite tongues and then folded away again because the tomb was shy. Imotekh filaments ticked like insects, thinking about biting, and then chose to wait for dessert. Scarab hives slept behind grills and dreamed about red. A guardian in the first rank lifted his hand and then dropped it again. He had been about to touch a rune scratched into the wall at shoulder height, an inviting little scrawl that begged to be read. He remembered his sergeant's voice saying, "The most dangerous thing in a dead man's house is a friendly sign." He did not touch it. He did not die, which felt like a miracle, which told him that he would have to pay for that miracle later. The storm behind them closed its fist and kept the sky theirs. Above, Zaren's cohorts finished their math and occupied every place a panicked enemy might try to claw back through. Along the entranceways, Imotekh wraiths uncoiled like bad thoughts and drifted through stone with the confidence of ghosts. Teleport grids sang to each other in knife-bright harmonics. The House of Somonor settled into an expression that said, "Welcome," in a language only a fool or a king could enjoy. Imotekh did not turn to watch the last Aeldar cross the threshold. He already knew. He could feel the weight of them in the way the floor vibrated, in the way the air choked on heat where there should be none, in the way the probability arcs tilted like wheat before a scythe. He said one word softly, and the storm dimmed its growl so the tomb could be heard. He told the cohorts ahead to fall farther back, smooth, 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 until the pursuit forgot itself and became hunger. In the net, a ranger's voice came thin and satisfied. "They are running. The bastards are finally running." Another voice, someone older, someone who had survived too many rooms that looked this honest, answered without heat. "No, they are making space. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut." Starbane heard both and took the gamble anyway, because that is what a commander does when every thread says the tapestry will never be finished if he does not pull. He tasted the storm, tasted the metal, tasted the lie in the air that had to be broken, or it would become truth by the simple trick of being believed. "Forward," he said, and the war host obeyed the way rain obeys gravity, and the decisive fight slid below the skin of the world where thunder could only listen. They went down into halls that had not tasted breath since stars wore different names. The first flights of stairs were honest stone, veined like old hands, cold to the touch, sweating a little where the storm's damp had crept. Then the strata changed without admitting it. Rock became engineered mass, mass became intention. The vaults opened at measured intervals, each space the same kind of wrong, too proportional, too calm, like a chapel that had been built by someone who admired numbers more than gods. The echoes were tidy. Footfalls came back, shaved thin, like the walls ate sound and handed you only what they thought you could be trusted with. Tomb servitors watched from niches, jointed arachnids with eyes like bottled lightning. When the first squads aimed, the machines skittered backward as if remembering etiquette, vanishing into slots that closed like lips. A pair of wreath-like constructs glided through a rib of stone and dissolved into it as if embarrassed to be seen. Contact dwindled to nothing. The last gorse murmurs fell away behind the warhost like a story someone stopped telling mid-sentence. No fresh firing glyphs ahead. No Orphidian shadows cutting the angles. Only that polished silence and the steady green breath of buried systems that had never learned to forget. Aeldari, Starbane, let the quiet be a trophy. He could feel the runes in the pocket of his mind, their cooled shapes reassuring under the hand of thought. The skeins bent toward yes. He had doubted them in other wars and been saved by that doubt. This time he allowed himself the cheap luxury of believing they liked him. He saw the foe breaking, not theatrically, but with the humiliation of a master who finds his house fills with water and cannot name the hole. The Stormlord's weather had done its work topside. It could not follow with the same teeth into the bones below. The tomb was coughing. The dynasty's rote had slipped. If the enemy wanted to make a labyrinth of it, then the Aeldari would be the knife that knew every turn before it met the eye. The labyrinth obliged. Corridors leaned very slightly without appearing to bend. Forks offered choices that were not. Side halls promised flank routes, and then, a dozen paces on, became softly indignant dead ends, their floors grooved as if traffic had once flowed and been politely erased. When they turned back, they found the main artery had grown brighter, more generous. The warhost moved with the efficiency of men who had fought in cities and inside ships and under mountains, and knew that generosity in a kill house is an insult. Still, the path ahead remained courteous. When they were tempted to slow, the floor smoothed. When they wanted to run, the ceiling lowered just enough to keep pride stooped. The Guardians kept a steady drum. Aspects tightened on cue as if pulled by strings around the spine of habit. The fire dragons held their anger like bent coals. Melter canisters looked against armor with a lover's care. Dark reapers carried their patient weight, heads turning a fraction, then stilling, their discipline, the kind of faith that does not need sermons. Falcons and serpents took their speed down to a crawl that would not betray them, engines purring like big cats promised meat later. A jet-like wing ghosted the high ribs of the corridor for a handful of breaths before the geometry refused them, and they were content to ghost backward again, mouths tight, eyes looking for the insult to answer later. The Pathfinders were the only ones who did not pretend. Any of it was polite. They moved like shadows that had learned to swear. One paused at a seam that was not a seam and set 2 fingertips to the stone. He felt vibration under his nails, faint, rhythmic, as if the floor were a drum built to a scale none of them sang. He bent, put his cheek to it, and listened until his ear throbbed. "That humming has opinions," he muttered. "The air on this side of the junction is different. It moves without a reason. There is a breath in the flagstones that does not belong to anything with lungs." Another ranger crouched under a grill that was not drawing or pushing and held a scrap of cloth cut thin enough to float at a sigh. The rag did not rise. It crawled sideways as if pushed by cold hands. He grunted, cut a notch on the underside of the lintel with a blade thin as thought, and said, "If this is a draft, then I am a saint. Someone is piping lies through the walls." They marked corners in a language the machine could not read. A flake of mica tucked into a crack that reflected a certain way. A smear of dust over a clean weld. A tiny loop of wire under a lip where only a brother would slide a finger. Their chatter on the bead was clipped and familial. Professional ugliness dressing fear in something that could walk. Do not trust an angle that looks proud of itself. If the floor feels proud, kick it. Twice. We are not here to admire. We are here to ruin. The warhost felt them up front and let that confidence wick backward. The skein stayed bright enough for Starbane to push a little more. He convinced himself, without saying it aloud, that the foe's order was a posture, that the neat lines and the prim retreats were a way of making their breaking appear dignified. He told himself that any real counterstroke would have chosen to bleed them on the stairs, that no king gives up vertical advantage if he has breath left. He touched the thought that this king was not a man. that this king read war in ledgers beyond blood, and he set that thought aside because it was trying to spoil the taste. The ports came thin and regular. No hostile signatures ahead, no new thermal, no gauze glow. The servitors that peaked were those polished spiders again, and they withdrew at the first pointed look, like debutantes afraid of a stain. The only heat was their own. The only arrogance was the tomb's. At the fifth junction, the air felt wrong enough that a warlock raised his hand. He opened his mind like a night flower and let the scheme brush it. For a heartbeat, he tasted a river of lions pulling toward a wide place, a tone like a bell rung in a room the bell despised. He paled, swallowed lightning, and said to Starbane, "My sight is a short ladder in a tall room." The storm still has teeth, even this deep. It chews threads. What I see looks like blessing, but it tastes like a dare. He wanted to add more. He did not. The Farseer's eyes never left the head of the corridor. He said, "We have made our offering, and the door has opened. We are not staying to debate with a door. Keep the cadence, keep the knives close. If we are being dead, we will accept and not be caught admiring the pose." They pressed into a gallery that had not earned the name. The ceiling rose by quiet increments, until even the reapers had the luxury of lifting their chins. Ribs gave way to arcades braced on pillars whose faces folded and unfolded with the patience of a book being read by someone who did not have to hurry. On either side, recesses recessed into deeper recesses, the perspective trick so carefully tuned that it made the eyes ache. The green working light came in through seams the size of eyelashes. The air grew colder in thin layers. A man could hold a hand out and feel the difference of a finger's width. The pathfinders noted the pattern and did not love it. One said, "This is a shepherd's crook pretending to be a straight rod." Another replied, "I have been crooked by worse. Keep right hands touching wall. If the wall moves your hand, shoot the part that moved." The first snorted, "I will shoot it twice." They came upon nothing that insisted on being fought. That was its own fight. The absence of Gauss had a taste, and the squads began to crave a shot to set their heartbeat right. A guardian cleared his throat 3 times and did not know he was doing it. A dragon cracked the knuckles inside his gauntlet and promised his weapon a sin soon. A reaper saw a perfect lane that deserved a missile and took a breath he could not justify to send one, then exhaled and let the ethic of ammunition talk him out of it. Their corridors began to grow wider without notice. The floor lost its pleasing grit and became a pale, glassy plane that reflected just enough to make every squad look like it had ghosts marching ahead. The sound returned a fraction thicker, not loud, but more present, like a room litigating what you were allowed to hear. Someone whispered that it felt like walking into a conversation halfway through when both speakers are trying to pretend they were not discussing you. And then the chamber opened. The vault rose into darkness, not because there was no light, but because the light did not care to reach that high. This space was a long inhale that never exhaled. Pillars stood at stately distances in a pattern too regular to be kind. Between them, the floor polished itself into a shallow basin whose curves felt accidental until you stood in it and realized you had been herded to the low point the way rainwater is taught to love drains. They were exits, many. They were tall, elegant, arched like compliments, each an invitation. Each placed at a kindness of angle that made a man feel he had chosen it. The chamber looked undefended. No coils thrummed, no muzzles teased the edges. The smell was cold stone and older oil and a hint of the storm's breath that had followed them down like an impolite guest. Guardians filed along the lip, fanning to either side with the reflex of men who have seen courtyards turn ugly. Dragons slowed to drink the shape and pick locks with their eyes that were not yet there. Reapers stepped to the natural perches on the inner ring where a good murder would be made into a craft. The jet-bike wings settled on their stands like sleek animals told to wait. Falcons and serpents rolled forward to hold down positions. a careful distance from the basin. Pathfinders did what they always did when a room looked innocent. They cursed. A ranger put his cheek to the floor again and felt the vibration heavier now, the buzz swelling like a wasp nest under the boards of an attic. "That drum is louder," he said. "It has found its tempo. Airflow is wrong times wrong. Feel that pull at the ankles. That is the room being polite. I do not like polite rooms." Another shaded his eyes and looked beyond the skin of the stone where the green seams breathed. He squinted hard enough to prune his face. On the far walls, spaced at precise intervals, he could make out housings that would have been nothing to anyone but a man who wanted very much to live. They were shallow, flush with the surface, coy about their function. He watched them, let his vision blur the way you do when you want to see something move in the corner. A ripple passed through the face of one housing, subtle as a sigh. The ranger hissed between teeth. "This place has eyelids," he said. And those eyelids just blinked. Starbane walked to the lip of the basin and tasted the skein. In his mind, the threads were a river bending toward an easy fall. He knew about confirmation and how it dressed itself as confidence. He knew the smell of his own pride when it wore perfect armor. He also knew the taste of opportunity and how it soured if you let doubt nibble it. The Farseer nodded as if addressing a council that had agreed with him. "We hold the ring," he said into the net. "We draw breath and then we press through. Reapers set the perimeter on the pillars and take the high killings. Dragons, tune your song. Guardians, lock shields and make a wall out of your ribs. Pathfinders, if anything blinks, if any stone breathes, if any floor sighs, I want to hear you swear so loudly the dead wake up to listen." Silence answered, like a man bracing. The chamber stayed serene. The housings did not admit to being housings. The shadows beyond them rippled again, tiny heat bugs crawling across glass, the sort of motion a tired eye could excuse. Along the far curve, the green working light licks the edge of an exit and retreated, coy. Somewhere in the deep, something heavy finished a cycle and clicked into place with the modesty of a knife slipping into a sheath. One of the Pathfinders could not help himself. He spoke low, as if the room cared about tone. "I have seen arenas built for confidence. This is one of them. The trick is simple. You convince a proud man he chose the middle because he is clever. Then you tell the ceiling to teach him about gravity." Another ranger spat on the floor. The spit ran toward the basin's center in a perfect, pretty curve. He did not bother to swear. He just set his rifle, took a breath, and started counting doors. Not because he would leave by one, but because it is good to know the names of teeth before they close. The chamber changed its mind in the space between a breath and the next. Every tall arch that had posed as an exit rippled the way heat does when it walks, and then flashed into hard clarity. A skin of nothing that was somehow a presence sealed the thresholds, planes of forced gravity and hooked light, invisible until a slant view made them glimmer like oil on dagger steel. One by one, the invitations became teeth. The room had been all polite gesture and easy grace. Now it was a jaw. Someone close to the nearest arch stepped with a scout's confidence and met the field at the shoulder. Armor rang like a bell slandered. The man bounced backward and hit the floor hard enough to cough blood into his mask. He sat there for a heartbeat, looking offended that the world had put hands on him, and then scrambled up, teeth bared, pride intact if nothing else. He said, "Fine, that door is a liar," and the men around him laughed because laughter is the easiest thing to lift. Beyond the nearest seal, in a corridor that had made itself a window, a phalanx of immortals waited in the easy discipline of the dead. Rank upon rank of green slits and metal calm, Gauss blasters held at a low, patient angle, as if the guns themselves could afford to be bored. In their center stood the Stormlord, a sliver of old malice sharpened to ceremony, a statue that had learned how to make weather its hobby. He lifted his chin by the width of a finger and gave the war host the courtesy of recognition. A salute without movement. The king showing his guests that yes, he was home. Eldar fire came like rain, educated by hatred. Shuriken streams sparking from the basin's lip, missile arcs from the inner ring that would have shaved saints if saints had orbits. The first bursts hit the fields with a sound like glass, learning a new prayer. Energy shears bent the shots, as if the air were full of hands adjusting trajectories. The razor discs slurred, found false angles, and zipped off at harmless diagonals that made the eye itch. Two missiles that should have turned, immortals into metallic chowder, became long tired sighs across the seals, and unwound their rage into the pillars instead, spalling stone into white spray. The Pathfinders cursed in a way that dignified the enemy more than their mothers. The Reapers adjusted and adjusted again, doing math with their thumbs and getting answers that were good jokes if you liked your humor fatal. A dragon exarch spat and tried a lance of heat at the seam where field should meet frame. The beam curved not much, but enough to teach humility, and wrote its name across a floor tile that hissed and pretended not to notice. A murmur started, the thin, stale breath of panic getting itself a room. A guardian hissed that they were boxed. Another said the obvious, that boxes can be burned from the inside. The tone on the net tightened, the way a rope does when you remember its purpose. Starbane put his voice through every skull it needed to visit. Hold the ring, arcs disciplined, not dramatic. Reapers, pattern on the pillars and the ceiling, not the seals. Dragons, kiss seams only in pairs where lenses blend. Guardians, shields tight. You are not a hillside, you are a wall. Pathfinders, centering, cross-cover. Any hole we find, we fill with auric spite. Breathe. Do your fucking jobs. His anger was cool. The room heard it and could not use it. The floor began to hum. Not loud, not yet. Low, like the sound a big cat makes when it thinks about hunger and you were too close to hear the thinking. It came up through their boots and along their shins, a tuned vibration that made molars itch and old scars remember winter. The hum crept up in steps so small that each breath thought nothing had changed, until your marrow noticed it had learned a new note. Helm displays fuzzed for a heartbeat, then cleared, then fuzzed again, thin little seizures of static that would have been funny if they had not started to synchronize. Warlocks reached into the skein and felt teeth. Threads frayed when touched, like hair burned at the ends. The futures ahead went soft at the edges, then hard, then soft. One of them caught Starbane's eye and shook his head without speaking. The Farseer did not ask for poetry. He fixed himself to the facts that still liked him. The enemy had shown himself, which meant the enemy wanted to be seen. The exits had been sealed, which meant the enemy wanted them still. The floor had begun to speak, which meant the room was getting ready to become an argument. Imotekh nodes in the walls tracked their own music with the smugness of a choir that knows the hymn everyone else will have to learn. Tiny filaments whisked through recesses, measuring their own vibrations. Scarab hives pricked and pried at vents fed to them by the architecture like newborns sniffing for milk. Somewhere outside human senses, a cryptek counted in a base too elegant for flesh and made a gesture that moved no air and changed everything that mattered. The amplitude rose toward the peak selected earlier when the Stormlord had been drawing lines through lives. Starbane looked for the Pharaon's gaze through the shifting mirrors of the seals. Imotech's head turned a degree, no hurry. For one heartbeat, iron met iron. The Stormlord's face did not know how to smile. It tilted, however, a tiny, exquisite motion full of exactly the right amount of contempt, and then returned to indifference. It was the kind of acknowledgement a duelist gives, a man already bleeding, the kind that says you are now a lesson. A guardian sergeant made his line talk. Check seals, he said. Every clasp, every lock. Bleed the air from your bad fantasies. Tighten under the arms. There will be crawling, there will be climbing, there will be biting. If anything moves that does not eat, shoot it anyway. His men obeyed, hands moving fast and clever over armor that had not had a chance to forgive itself for the surface. They closed gaps, ratcheted plates, re-rigged breather valves until the room smelled of hex sealant and the rich tang of men who planned to survive out of spite. Aspect squads braced without theatre. The dragons walked canisters down to rests and raised muzzles, 2 finger widths to account for the fields. The reapers locked into stillness, like gargoyles who had finally chosen a building worth protecting. The howling wind of any other shrine was not here. The craft world's quiet killers were quiet now. The line thickened its skin and narrowed its eyes. Pathfinders slipped into the middle like ink into water and made a ring out of rigor. They knelt back to back in a circle the size of a small oath, rifles covering spokes, every overlap a deliberate redundancy. Their voices went down to a hush that left room for the hum. They shared tiny jokes with murder in them because it kept hands steady. If anything pops ahead, I want it to regret education. If anything creeps, I want it to learn about velocity. They sounded calm even when they were lying. The hum on the floor swelled from prayer to threat. It climbed the bones like a slow fire. The air gathered the tone and began to carry it. A pressure in the sinuses, a tickle at the back of the tongue, a taste like coins. Stone pillars throbbed a degree out of phase, and that made the teeth hurt behind the eyes. The basin floor flexed, not much, but enough to make knees say, "That is not solid." A dragon murmured that he would like a target that bled. No one laughed. Imotekh did nothing visible. That was the trick. A gesture would have pleased the enemy. A speech would have given them a handle to hold. He stood behind the field with an immortal phalanx as if this were an inspection, and in a way it was. He inspected their fear. He checked their discipline for cracks. He admired their stubbornness briefly. Then he let the room take over. The amplitude hit the height a cryptek had chosen while he was still deciding what color the storm should be. For a breath, the noise was everything. Then, abruptly, it was nothing. Silence slammed back into the chamber, the way a door slams when someone wants you to jump. In that silence, men heard their own breaths and decided they did not like the sound. A half-dozen hands tightened on grips they had already been squeezing. Someone clipped a tongue against the roof of his mouth to make sure he still owned his skull. The silence broke along the seams. The vents that had looked like brushstrokes along the walls snapped into attention, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, small as a man's palm, flush with stone until they were not. They opened all at once, with the neatness of a book being clapped shut by a librarian who has lost patience. The sound they made was not a hiss. Hissing implies air. This was the dry, hungry rustle of something that had been waiting a very long time and was now being fed. The first surge came in a line that looked like dust caught in a gust, and then turned red as if the room had decided to bleed out of its own pores. It poured low, hugging the floor for now, a storm of points and edges that behaved like a thought. It moved around ankles as if ankles were suggestions. It found the seams of boots like water finds a leak, and it learned names as it moved because everything in it was a mouth. A guardian stared too long, unwilling to believe anything so small could be this angry, and swore a word that had been taught to him by a man who died in another war. He raised his boot, as if the right stomp could insult physics back into order. The swarm climbed without hurry. It looked like rust learning to crawl. It looked like a red fog teaching itself to chew. It made a sound like teeth being counted. He screamed in a tone that would make men wake with wet faces for years. The ring tightened. The reapers fired into the floor because that was suddenly the most honest place to put a missile. The dragons dragged heat down into the swarm and turned patches black and brittle that shattered under boot and evaporated back into motion. 2 heartbeats later. Starbane did not waste time demanding courage. He did not say steady because everyone was about to become steadier than they had any right to be or die trying. He gave orders that were knives, foam at the joints, heat in short sermons, no heroics, nothing gets up your arms, keep the ring. If anyone falls, cut him out of his own boots. If you have to choose between mercy and math, you already know my choice. Beyond the fields, the Stormlord did not blink. His immortals lifted their guns to the height. Polite people hold cigars and waited for the next beat in the music. The seals rippled once, as if enjoying themselves. The vents opened wider. The swarm's red brightened to the color of blood, told a secret, and the chamber forgot that it had ever wanted to be generous. They came like a blush turning into a hemorrhage, a low red weather uncoiling out of every seam the eye had written off as decoration. Events that had looked like polite brushstrokes became mouths, and from those mouths poured clouds of glittering hatred, a dust storm made of teeth. The swarm hugged the floor at first, a tide that remembered rivers, halls and eddies around boots and rubble, filling the basin with a quiet skitter that set nerves on edge. Then it climbed. Where armor met glove, it learned. Where greave met boot, it learned faster. Hairline seams became roads. The first man to curse them like an inconvenience stamped without thinking, and the red flood went up his shin, under his plates, questing, humming. He bent, too late, and the sound that came out of him was what happens when a choir boy learns the hymn is a knife. The nano scarabs found soft and busied themselves, each the size of a pinhead, each full of old hunger, each deciding with exact cruelty which layer to slice, which nerve to introduce to daylight. Blood jetted into a mist that floated for a heartbeat and then rained back as a tacky dew. The ring closed like a fist, shields locked, ankles braced, muzzles down to write sermons into the floor. Dragons jagged their heat in clipped bursts, not rivers but knives, cutting swaths of the tide into black crusts that shattered under boot, and then, traitorously, tried to become motion again. The Reapers broke discipline long enough to drop rounds square into the red, explosives dialing themselves to low to keep shrapnel honest, blasts punching pits in the basin that filled back up, a blink later as if the room had decided gravity was ornamental. Foam in the seams, a guardian sergeant barked, voice so steady it felt like theft. Inside elbows, backs of knees, under greaves, around gloves, do not fucking inhale. If you feel crawling, cut the piece off you do not need. Medici packs slid hand to hand, white lozenges and spray wands bruising palms. Men slapped them open with a speed that came from never wanting to be this smart again. Seals hissed. Gel foamed. Fingers moved at panicked expert speed, tracing edges, drawing cork white where once there had been quiet gaps. Those still clean worked on their brothers with the intimacy of lovers and the profanity of butchers, swatting at stray glitter with the flats of knives, scraping with the last respect of men who know how thin life is. A reaper went down to one knee with a groan so small it did him justice. The swarm had found his thigh seam and begun a neat, enthusiastic tunnel. He took a saw from his belt and, teeth clenched, cut his own plate free, then raked a dragon's wash across the wound long enough to cook the little bastards into black sugar. He screamed once, breathed twice, and got back up as if pain were a rumor. "I'm not done," he hissed. "Get off me." Pathfinders at the center ring worked like a nest of snakes made of discipline. Barrage fire stitched the floor at measured intervals, each man owning a slice of circle, angles overlapping, every gap already spoken for by someone's mean little promise. They called shots low, in human words that sounded like feasts for engines. A red ton of the swarm came worrying at a boot, and a ranger put a shard of monomolecular argument through it, as if he were picking his teeth. The clouds splashed, recoiled, divided, tried again somewhere else. A boot heel came down. A knife went in. A curse followed, and laughter, and then another curse, because laughter was expensive. The hum thickened, then scissored out, like a machine settling into the right gear. Men felt it leave and did not miss it. They had too much to do. Somewhere beyond the seals, an immortal fired a contemptuous crack across the ceiling, one green line to remind the room who owned the tempo, and then went back to waiting in that terrible statue, patience the dead had perfected. The Stormlord watched from behind a curtain of distorted air, head angled a fraction to the side like a judge sampling a vintage. He could afford not to move. He knew the hour. Starbane's voice did not climb. It sank, calmer than the blood running off his boots. Hold the line, short heat, not long, foam your brothers, seal what you can. If it climbs your neck, you tell me, and I will put you down myself before those bastards finish the job. No one dies begging. We do not give them the music. A dragon crooned to his canister, like a man soothing a hungry child, and poured a strip of white heat along a seam where a guardian had started to convulse. The foam boiled, the red things curled, the man thrashed and then stilled, not dead, not yet. His hand found the dragon's wrist and squeezed, strength there, and the dragon yanked the glove free and spat a laugh. Still with us, ugly, keep breathing. Hate helps. They fought that fight for what felt like a long, thin prayer stretched until it was ready to tear. The swarm kept learning, and the warhost kept teaching. Shuriken streams bit into the cloud as if each disc had decided to be a broom. Melted patches hardened and were stamped to powder. Helm filters whined, men coughed black and tasted copper and the acid buzz of machine blood. A reaper vomited into his mask and ripped it off in a motion that would have been a death sentence if the Pathfinders had not already cut a clean space around him to commit that sin. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and swore with gratitude so bitter it could have been love. Then the weather changed. Janst. The red dulled, the crawling slowed, the hum dropped to a murmur and then stopped. Events clicked shut with that same librarian impatience, as if the room had finished a paragraph and was no longer interested in the subject. The clouds sagged and collapsed into slag islands, glossy black, skittering now only in memory. Men kept shooting until discipline touched their hands and reminded them how much ammunition weighed. Heat washers peeled across the last living tongues until even stubborn specks turned to ash. Silence came back, temporary, smug. The floor shone with a wet mirror's shame, slick with blood that made boots skate and soles flinch. Steam rose in white snakes from patches of cooked armor. The air stank of burned oil, hot copper, adhesive, a sweet rotten note that is always human. Starbane looked at his line and saw that it was still a line. It was ragged, dented, bled thin at the edges, but it held. He let himself eat one bite of relief. Survival, however costly, gave his pride something to sharpen itself on. He told himself the worst had been a trick of appetite, that the Stormlord had spent the cleverest of his cruelties at the beginning. The tides that begin red often ebb. You ride them and mark the rocks. He stepped high to keep his boots from slipping and raised an arm. Reset arcs. Reaper math only on pillars and corners. Dragons reload and keep your sermons short. Medicae, triage by breathing. If he is screaming, he is not first. Rangers, watch the ceilings. If anything twitches, unteach it the concept. Beyond the refracting fields, the Fearon did not bestow the kindness of approval or the sport of mockery. He stood like a monument to contempt. Immortal phalanx around him like parentheses. He had not so much as shifted his weight. If his mind counted the corpses and the pints, it counted in a base that made loss look like interest rather than debt. Guardian Medicae unrolled their kits and turned the basin into a maze of little clinics scratched into the aftermath. Foam roses blossomed over torn seals. Needles like perfect nails went into arms that had forgotten how to be owned. Those with bite tracks that went too deep were wrapped in resin-hardened splints and slid to the rear of the ring. Not left, never left, always eyes on, always a blade nearby for a favor no one wanted to ask. Bone singers would have done better. There were none here. These were guardians with clever hands and bad news to deliver. Hack that seal until it refuses to leak, Imotekh told a man who could not stop trembling. I do not care if you cannot feel the leg, you can feel the hate. That is enough. Breathe in, breathe out. If your breath smells like pennies, you tell me. Aspect leaders walked the circle without making noise and put order in place like they were laying tiles. Heads dipped, hands signed, small corrections hissed between clenched teeth. Reapers set their sights back where logic demanded and let the neurons that had been screaming settle into a scope's cool little tunnel. Dragons checked canisters, licked fingers, brushed residue from nozzles like priests polishing relics. Guardians slotted fresh cells and thumbed runes with the neat impatience of men who want to be told the next sin to commit. No one wasted a shot on the dark to prove courage. The Pathfinder's world narrowed to a tired haze laced with floating black flecks. They blinked their lenses clean, spit out grit, and drew lines through the air that only they saw, passing ownership of angles back and forth with a handful of syllables. I have the left corner's left shadow, one said. I want the right's right. Take it, another answered. If anything blinks, I will name its eyelid. They were men waiting for the next shoe to drop and daring it to land on their teeth. A dragon looked down and realized his boot was filling with someone else's blood. He snorted, shook the foot, and muttered, "This fucking place," as if complaining about the weather. He rechecked a gauge, slapped the side of the canister, and looked up in time to see a ripple move along the vault high above, too fast to be a trick of breath, too slow to be honest air. Ceilings, a ranger said, not loud, not soft, just true. Ceilings. Starbane followed the line of the man's rifle with his eyes and saw the shadows bunched along the upper ribs, those shallow housings that had been coy as the room filled and hateful when it sang. Something had changed there. The black learned a new shade. A shape dragged itself forward, then another, then too many to be counted, without turning, counting into a ritual for distraction. Fingers, like hooked knives, kissed stone. Faces hung like masks on skulls that had once been men if you believed in bad jokes. Strips of skin dangled like flags from shoulders fashioned of wrong iron. Brace, said Starbane, the word dull and flawless. Keep the ring. If it drops, you greet it. The ceiling shed its nightmares. They came down in sheets and clumps and solitary pounces, a rain of butchered saints and butcher knives, flayed ones with their claws already singing, meat flags flapping, eyes empty of everything but the work. The first landed on a reaper's perch and opened him from collar to gut with a speed that made the cut feel polite. The second hit the ring, and the ring hit back, blades and bolts and flame answering with a chorus that had not yet learned the word mercy. The chamber forgot it had ever been quiet, and learned a new noise that would not be forgiven. They fell like butchered saints shaken loose from the rafters, claws already singing, strips of skin flapping from their frames like trophies stolen off a battlefield altar. The first one landed on the inner ring with the tactless grace of a guillotine, cleaved a reaper from collar to gut, and flung the halves aside as if tidying. A second hit a knot of guardians and scissored arms apart at the elbows before anyone remembered to scream. The air filled with the high keening of murder made into a habit. Isolated shapes died first. A ranger who had edged too far to check a flank took a rake across the backplate that turned ceramic to petals and muscle to red ropes. He staggered, swung his rifle like a club, and a second, flayed one took his head with a paring motion neat as a kitchen chore. A guardian who had chased a skittering patch of the red swarm, a heartbeat too long, looked up into a mask that still remembered the expression of the one it had been cut from and froze as the claws came in from 3 directions at once. Panic nibbled at discipline and then bit down. The line shuddered. The backs together, a sergeant barked, voice hard enough to bruise. No lone heroes. If it smiles at you, blind it. If it sings, kill it twice. Knots formed by instinct and drill, pairs, triads, little hedgehogs grown from fear and practice. Shields met, muzzles crossed, boot heels found purchase in a slick of blood that tried to insist on comedy. Shurikens spat outward in measured fans, monomolecular razors humming through the close air, carving strips from ebon limbs and knocking teeth from those stolen masks. Dragons dipped their nozzles and coughed short sermons of heat across the floor, searing clawed feet to black glass long enough to buy a breath. A reaper, bleeding from the seam where thigh met cod. Hand signed for a short round and put it into a pouncing silhouette, catching it mid-air and atomizing it into a dirty confetti that pattered across helms. "Come on then," a guardian snarled through the mask, voice shaking with joy and terror married. "Come on, you skin-wearing bastard. Let's see if your goddamn hands can juggle bullets." They came in waves, hateful patience between them. Each rush hammered the ring, found a weak seam, and poured knives into it. Each time the ring cramped tighter, men interlocked, tongues counting without knowing they were counting. 1 and 2, and breathe, 1 and 2 and breathe. The first rush turned the basin lip into a throat clobbed with meat. The second built the heap higher, flayed ones clambering over their own dead like spiders over egg sacs, blades clicking, masks empty of everything but task. The third met shuriken that arrived like rain learned arithmetic, a lattice of fire so precise it cut in hexagons. The fourth broke against dragon heat that painted the chamber with greasy smoke and made old oil and roasted copper the only weather that mattered. Between waves, there were breaths that tasted like victory if you did not mind blood. Corpses piled into berms that were not part of the architect's plan. Black ichor mixed with Aeldari red and turned to a tacky sludge that clung to boots and made every stand an argument with friction. Armor smoked, filter packs wheezed grief. Men vomited and vomited again, and when they emptied themselves they fought some more and called it faith because it was simpler that way. The flayed ones learned weariness. They began to circle, not pouncing but stalking, the way a knife is a threat even when it is at rest. They tested the ring with feints like the twitch of a surgeon's finger above living flesh. They paced along the berm of their dead and the dead of the enemy, claws clicking a little, not frightened, never frightened, simply waiting for the song to change pitch. They wore their human rags like victory banners, and, when the drafts played at those rags, the illusion of faces seemed to cry without sound. Starbane read the rhythm and did not flatter himself that he owned it. He tightened the formation until even hatred would have to ask permission to slip between elbows. A hedgehog grew from the ring, consummate against teeth and knives, exactly what close murder hates to bite. It gave up lanes and latitudes. It surrendered mobility as a price paid with clean hands. It made a fortress of ribs and shields and overlapping muzzles and a prayer shaped like geometry. It also made itself a promise to any enemy that could bring a flood of massed fire. That promise would be called in later. Starbane showed his teeth to the thought and shelved it. Comms compressed down to muscle memory. Hands signed words faster than teeth could shape them. Left shade, stand to, right spear, short light. Mark hatchling, bleed, step, set, breathe. Voices dropped to syllables with corners you could grip. A dragon tapped a guardian on the knuckle and flicked 2 fingers down to tell him to lower his muzzle, a finger's width. A ranger snapped his hand sideways twice to say door blind left and had his angle borrowed and returned in a heartbeat. A reaper touched the barrel of his launcher to a pillar and traced it up to say iron above you, and the guardian ducked as a claw sliced the air, a finger's breadth behind his helm. Exhaustion arrived like a tax collector with a smile. Foam seals had hardened to ridges that chafed. Chafe turned skin to weeping pink. Sweat turned the weeping into a saltburn. Arms shook, fingers cramped. The drumbeat of shuriken fire faltered and picked up and faltered again, not from panic now, but from the body's rude insistence on being meat. Blood loss began its quiet arithmetic. A guardian blinked, and the world narrowed to a tunnel edged in yellow light. He breathed in and out, and the tunnel widened enough to admit duty, and he stayed. Another sagged and straightened and sagged again, eyes half-lidded under the visor, a brother's hand gripping the harness and shaking him back into the ugly present. Bleed-outs can be louder than kills. A dragon rummaged for a fresh canister and realized he was shivering so hard the latch would not lift. A Imotekh slammed the latch for him, stuffed a stim into his neck hard enough to bruise, and slapped him. "Heat the floor," the Imotekh said. "You can sleep when there is no floor." The dragon laughed without humor and did as he was told, arc of fire carving a no-go crescent. The flayed ones declined to test immediately. The waves thinned. The flayed ones fell in doubles and trios, each one dying without theatre. Only that mechanical insistence on closing the gap as far as possible, even while collapsing. The ring's return fire kept its cruelty. Shuriken found necks where human necks might have been. Heat strokes made silhouettes slough like candles tipped over upon themselves. A guardian with a bayonet fixed to a rifle stabbed up under a ribcage, hung with a sash of tanned skin and twisted until something came loose with a thick pop. When the thing tried to stand on habit alone, the guardian kicked it hard in the knee and it folded like bad furniture. Pauses lengthened. The space between rushes became a corridor where breaths could line up and ask permission to happen. Rangers re-sighted the high ribs and found nothing but shadow that pretended to be deeper than it was. A reaper took advantage of the stillness to pry loose a shard lodged in the launcher frame. He held the barbed thing up and said to nobody, "The room is trying to eat the tools," and flicked it away. Two guardians re-wrapped a tourniquet on a third and did not say that the limb attached to it had begun to decide that it did not belong to a living person anymore. The flayed ones finally held the circle at a respectful distance. They crept along the berm of corpses with a predator's elegance, chins lifting a little to taste the air, as if the human skin draped on their frames carried old instincts. One of them stacked on the face it wore. The mask shifted, stretched, found the memory of a mouth, and grinned in a way that could have been accidental. The guardian facing it drew a slow breath, cracked his neck left and right, and said conversationally, "Fuck you," and kept his muzzle still. A minute passed. Maybe more. The chamber's green light seemed to recede and then return, subtle tides matching the tremors of engines a world away. The storm overhead rumbled, and the sound crawled down stone in a way that made it feel like a cat rolling over on your spine. Starbane stood inside the hedge of shields and made the hard choice that kept people alive. He did not tell them they had won. He told them not to move. He told them that this was where they would die if they fidgeted. He told them the next rush would come when their breath had gone lazy and their grips had loosened and their eyes had lost the taste of the edge. But then he fell silent so they could use silence to load their hands with strength. One by one, in small careful motions, leaders reset arcs and checked magazines and swapped half-spent cells for full. Rounds were counted like prayers, lips moving, the math stinging the tongue. A dragon loosened his shoulders and rolled the ache out in small circles and told his canister the next kiss would be shorter and sweeter. A pathfinder drew a knife along his bootsole to clear it of plotted meat, wiped the blade on his thigh out of habit, and shifted his aim a degree and a half to cover a slice of shadow no one else loved. When the next rush did not come, courage walked off and came back with doubt. The ring held. The flayed ones began to recede, step by backward step, claws leaving snail trails in the gore, heads tilted in an idiot curiosity that made them look almost human for a heartbeat. A sergeant lifted his rifle an inch, thinking he saw the opening. All hunters eventually see when prey begins to lose interest. Starbane's hand smacked his forearm down. "No," he said, level. "They are not prey. They are someone's fingers." Fingers move when they are told. As if on cue, the whole pack halted at the same time, like a puppeteer had tightened a line. They cocked their heads together, that awful chorus of stolen faces realigning to hear the same drum. Then, with a glide that denied their weight, they faded into the vaulting shadow almost in unison. No rush, no dramatic exit, no taunt, simply gone, like knives laid back into a drawer by a cook who had remembered a different course. The vault took a long, slow breath and forgot it had lungs. Noise fell away in tatters. Men heard their hearts and hated the sound. The smell of hot copper settled and got comfortable. Steam shrank. Flames crackled in tiny, embarrassed ways as if they had overperformed earlier and now had nothing better to do. Someone coughed into a mask, and the cough sounded obscene in the quiet. "Do not break posture," Starbane said, not whispering, not raising his voice. "Hold the hedgehog. The moment you think you have earned a rest is the moment you die." Leaders speak. Medicae, count your miracles. Reapers, retask to sealing ribs and pillars. Dragons, half loads only. Rangers, I want to know where the shadows learn to walk. Acknowledgements clicked, economical, satisfied to be living enough to say yes. A Medicae crawled to a guardian whose leg had gone to a colour that does not belong on anyone. He peeled foam, hissed and packed more, squeezing the cartridge until the nozzle bent. "You are not dying here," he told the limb's owner. "You are going to live long enough to hate this room." The guardian nodded once, the kind of nod that admits a future only so it has something to spit on. Beyond the refracting walls, the Stormlord did not clap. The immortals did not shift weight. In that impassive stillness was a lesson. The thing you think you survived is a prelude. Somewhere deeper, something heavy finished turning a thought into a law. The floor faintly learned a new hum, too quiet to be sound, just loud enough to be a feeling in the teeth. The quiet thickened into a skin. It stretched over the ring and made it an egg waiting for a hammer. Time lengthened like an unbroken breath, and in that breath men found out how honest their discipline was. A ranger licked dry lips and watched the place where the flayed ones had vanished and thought, there is a second course. A dragon kissed a knuckle against the canister in the old superstition. A reaper whispered a count to keep the tremor from his trigger finger. A guardian stared at the blood river under his boots and saw his reflection bleed back and decided to hate it enough to continue. The vault became very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that old hunters trust and young ones confuse with mercy. Somewhere, a drop of something fell, and the sound seemed important. Starbane listened, eyes narrow, waiting for the next shape the room would teach itself to be. He did not believe in reprieve. He believed in tempo. The enemy had set it. He would find the downbeat by standing still long enough to hear the baton lift. The quiet had the weight of a blade held an inch from the throat. Then the nearest seal sighed, folded like a thought changing its mind, and vanished. The corridor beyond did not lunge. It merely admitted to being a gun barrel aimed at the heart of the ring. The immortals stepped forward in perfect, cruel rhythm, gorse blasters held in that low, patient way that says this will take exactly as long as it needs, and not a breath more. In their midst, the Stormlord inclined his head a fraction, as if granting permission to physics. The first volley tore the world. Green unlight scraped the basin in long slabs. Where the beams kissed, matter unlearned itself. Armor unraveled into shrieking molecules, and then into the dust that mourns nothing. A reaper's torso went stringy and fluttered apart in a sound like a hymn being shredded. A guardian lifted a shield and watched it turn transparent as its lattice fell out of love with holding together. The beam went through him with the weary inevitability of winter. A dragon took a grazing cut across ribs, and the ribs turned into sparking lace. He looked down and laughed the wrong laugh until a brother shoved a sealant slab under the plate and dragged him into cover by the harness. "Down," someone shouted, "useless inhuman." Shuriken answered in angry curtains. But the hedgehog had made itself small to survive the knives, and small is meat to the long guns. Every man who lifted higher than a measured inch paid for the inch with light and a sound no one ever forgets. Friendly fire is a sin for the living. For the Necrons, it was arithmetic. The flayed ones, still clinging where the vaulting met shadow, slipped aside a heartbeat before each sweep. Angles practiced for an age, moving like knives laid flat and slid under the beam. Those too slow did not curse. They simply vanished, erased with the efficient indifference given to smears on glass. The immortals did not adjust aim for them, did not accommodate, did not care. The calculus was simple. Enemies in a cup. Pour until cup is empty. "Push left," a sergeant snapped, and the left tried. Gauss stitched the motion into regret, scything ankles and knees, laying men along the lip like cut flowers. "Push right," came the echo, and right found a wall of green laid across its face, the beams walking slow and sure, cleaning, cleaning, cleaning. A dragon pair made their run through the depths, melter tongues ready to write unkindness into the forward line. The first heads a column of refracted light that bent his flame sideways into nothing, and the second caught the return rig square and fell in two neat parts that did not seem to know they were lonely until they stopped twitching. The hedgehog held because it had to. Starbane's voice threaded the ring, quiet, unyielding, the only unbroken thing. "Do not give them height. Do not give them a silhouette. Fire in halves. If you stand, you die. If you crawl, you live long enough to be angry. Dragons cut seams in pairs. Do not adore your heat. Reapers, kiss the pillars. Do not argue with the field. Rangers, punish anything that makes the mistake of leaning." The immortals accepted the punishment when it came, because their bodies did not own the concept of shame. Shuriken plicked shoulders to sparks. Missiles bruised armor into ugly dents that closed like mouths remembering their manners. A few fell, and when they fell, they folded back into the corridor on rails of sick light, to be replaced by twins that stepped over their absence without glancing down. The line kept walking and kept firing, and the beams wrote narrow avenues of unbeing through Aeldari flesh and steel with that ghastly courteous hum. Close ranks, a guardian sergeant roared, coughing red. "If there is air between you and your brother, I will fill it with my hand." The men obeyed, elbows kissing, helmets almost knocking, the hedgehog tightening until there was nothing in it that massed fire could not call a target. The price of surviving knives had been paid. Now the receipt arrived as a fusillade. When the line faltered, when the hedgehog showed its first tired seam, they came. Lichgard entered the hall like a conclusion, shields like slabs of judgment, blades bright with rules, footwork that made geometry blush. They advanced in a single, implacable front, the immortals' beams cutting lanes, the lichgard owning them. A shuriken volley went high, shield faces drank it with a hiss. A dragon poured a white tongue on the angle where iron met arm. The dispersion plane turned the heat aside as if it had been given notice. A ranger found a sliver under a rim and put a shot into the tendon. The lichgard answered by stepping in and ending him with a movement too simple to name. "Counter," a reaper barked, voice thinning to a thread. A few did. A guardian triad surged from cover, bayonets low, a suicidal profession of stubborn pride. The first lichgard met the lead thrust, turned it as if turning aside a question, and split the man left to right so quickly, the halves took a heartbeat to fall. The second and third thrusts landed in the same shield, kissed, died. The returning sweep took both heads in a single polite gesture and walked on, the bearer already raising his arm to accept the next volley for the wall. A falcon, limping and hateful, ground its belly across fractured stone to bring its gun to bear. The immortals glanced at it the way bored men check a clock. A lattice of Gauss stitched the hull. Plates fell away from plates in little size. Cables frayed. The engine coughed and coughed again and gave up on being a heart. A crew climbed out smoking and were cut apart in the time it takes to inhale a ragged laugh. They died with dignity because there was no time to choose another thing. Cohesion stopped being a property and became a memory. The ring collapsed inward, then broke with a pop like a rib under too much weight. Fire lanes crumpled, angles died, command devolved to whoever had a voice and a hand that would not shake. Cells formed the way they do when men are about to be stories. A dragon pair propped back to back with a guardian curled between their knees, aiming by feel. A reaper and a ranger sharing a pillar as if it were a lover, shoulders touching between shots. A warlock crouched under a broken slab, runes flickering at his fingers like insects trying to find a light in a storm that hated lights. He tried to cut a seam in the air with thought. The field took his will and bent it like a piece of wire, harmless and pretty. He spat, dragged a wounded man into the shade, and went on stabbing at reality with the little knives he had left. The immortals advanced to conversational distance and kept up their ruthless grammar. The beams walked through pockets that had been men. The lichgard sealed the argument with each step, shield faces overlapping into a moving wall, blades placing punctuation that ended sentences. A guardian tried to crawl under that wall and plant a charge like a germ at the foot of a god. A boot pressed his wrist flat until bones powdered, and the blade taught him about quiet. A dragon laughed, wild, scorched the rim of a shield and half a face behind it, tasted triumph and then dissolved from the waist up as a line of green found him and politely insisted on nothingness. Starbane lived because men kept dying around him with the intention that he should. The last of his cadre closed on him like ribs, taking shots that would have broken him, stepping into angles that would have made his end artful. He hated them for it, in the way any commander must, and loved them in the only way he was allowed. He burned lanes with his pistol, he cut with a spear that hummed with a civilized malice. He addressed the Stormlord with his eyes whenever he had a breath free, and the Stormlord addressed back with uninterest. The exchange had the dignity of a ritual neither enjoyed. A ranger cell tried to break for a pillar gap, knives out, rifles slung, that old assassin hunger saying, maybe, just maybe. The immortal fire net closed on them like a mouth learning to smile. One fell in halves that did not agree. One lost both arms of the biceps and ran 2 steps before he worked out that he had changed tribes. The last reached the pillar, leaned his back against it, and slid down in slow astonishment, trying to laugh around the hole where his middle had been. A lichgard peeled him off the stern with the point of a blade and set him down like trash set aside while you sweep. Somewhere, a guardian tried to shout a prayer and found his tongue stuck to his teeth with cooked blood. He said something filthy instead, and that was better. A warlock clutched a rune to his chest and worked at it with the drag of a drowning man. The rune dimmed like a coal left in rain. A reaper pulled a second man into his little barricade with his forearm and realized it was a corpse when the head lolled. He propped it anyway, because a friend's weight can still hold a wall. The immortals slowed when they were meant to slow. The lichgard stepped wide, then closed again, wall to wall, polish to polish. Every pocket was erased in order of threat, not pity. The last dragon to die cursed the room for being tidy. The last ranger to die offered the nearest lichgard a lesson in bone spurs with his boot, and got a blade through the temple for his initiative. The last reaper to die had no rockets left, and clubbed a skull with the empty tube until a beam made him a story. The last warlock to die saw a shape of a door that would have been useful if he had 3 heartbeats more. He had 2. When the killings stopped being loud, it kept being work. The isolated cells that had remembered how to fight their own wars were taken in hand, pared down, and extinguished with the same patience a man uses to snuff candles after a vigil. The Necron line never hurried. Haste was beneath an answer. The last pockets turned into stains, while the lichgard's shields barely kissed. Starbane's world narrowed to a ring of men who would not let him fall, and the slow approach of inevitability. Then that ring had too many holes in it to be a shape. Hands took his weapons away with the tender care of thieves who respect craft. A dispersion plane rolled him onto his back when he tried to rise, boots planted around him in a neat square that had all the warmth of a well-made box. He reached for the skein and found wire, cut ends, stubs that refused to braid, a song that had been turned to stuttering. They dragged the surviving cadre to the foot of the open seal like a fisherman pulling a stained net out of a cold sea. A few guardians on their knees, a reaper breathing through a whistle in his throat, a dragon missing a hand and trying to make a fist from habit, a ranger with one eye glued shut with the red and the other bright and hateful. They were herded into a tidy line by blade tips, and the kind of casual contempt only a practiced victor can afford. None begged. A few laughed. One coughed a laugh and spat something black on the floor and aimed his head like a gun at the Stormlord. The Pharaon did not speak first. He let the immortals settle into their resting stances, blasters politely lowered, and the lichgard adopt an artful square that framed the scene as if it were a fresco. When he moved, it was to tilt his chin that hair's breadth, and consider the prisoners the way a collector considers pieces rescued from a fire. His hand described a small shape in the air. Mercy, but not compassion. Forgiveness, but only as a way to tidy a ledger. A lichgard stepped to the first kneeling guardian and gave him the gift of quickness. Blade down, neck parted, head bowed out of habit, then rolled. The second received the same courtesy. The third tried to rise and had his knee tacked to the floor by a neat thrust before the long cut. The reaper got a beam instead, an immortal stepping in and writing a line through the sternum with that soft, dreadful hum. A dragon who had been nursing the ghost of a fist met a shield edge and then had no more work to do. The ranger got the longest look, the Stormlord taking a fraction of a heartbeat to admire a thorn that had pricked him twice this day. Then the gesture, then the end, clean as law. Starbane remained, hauled upright by grips that might as well have been clamps. His breath fogged the inside of his helm with the quickness of fury and fear married. He fixed on the Stormlord and did not offer the insult of words that would not be heard. Imotekh studied him in the way a jeweler studies a flaw that makes a gem interesting. He lifted a finger and traced a vertical line in the air as if choosing a cut. Not yet, his eyes said. Not here. Your end must be work, not punctuation. They knocked Starbane to his knees gently, because gentleness is how you salt a humiliation. The floor under him was slick and cold, and full of echoes of men who had been better and worse than he, and all equally dead. A lichgard's blade hovered just above a carotid. The Pharaon lifted his hand minutely. The blade paused. The calculus had found a use that needed a living variable. The immortals broke line to collect the last trinkets from the wrecks and the bodies. Carefully, the way men clear a sanctum, they pretend not to understand. The lichgard finished the other accounts with swift, abstract motions until no one on the Aeldari side made noise useful enough to be called a voice. Heat bled from stones. Steam retreated into soft ropes. The particles' stink folded in on itself and made a film across the tongue. The chamber stilled. Beyond the seal, mechanisms muttered to themselves with the smugness of chores completed. Here and there, a plate pinged as it cooled, a small bright note in the vast wrongness. Drops fell from the high ribs and found blood and made little red galaxies. Weapons lay where hands had forgotten them, sights staring at nothing, muzzles beginning to look like mouths too tired to bite. A pathfinder's charm, A tiny hoop of wire and mica spun once on the stone and lay flat. The tick of cooling armor took over the work of marking time. In that softness, Starbane stared up at the Stormlord and wished for one more clean mistake to exploit, and the Stormlord looked down as if composing an epigram that would be cruel and true and require no revision. They lined the dead with a tidiness that felt obscene. Blades finished what beams had begun, and the chamber's last voices shut off the way a machine stops when the hand is removed from the lever. Eldorath Starbane knelt in the slick and made himself watch. He forced his eyes to stay open when a lichgard sword lifted and fell, when a guardian's head bowed out of habit an instant before the cut, when a ranger grinned with half a mouth and offered a curse before the blade put a period on him. He kept watching when a reaper's chest opened like a cupboard and the light inside went out. He counted, not to remember, but to deny the enemy the luxury of being the only one doing arithmetic. When the last of his cadre sagged sideways and settled, the Stormlord moved with the consideration of a man choosing a tool. Immortals flanked him like brackets around a sentence that did not dare change meaning. The lichgard formed a square that could have been a frame for a painting of humiliation. The Pharaon's face had the patience of weather. He regarded Starbane the way a jeweler studies a flaw that makes a gem expensive. "Only you," Imotekh said, voice clean as a whetted edge. "Only you go on." "On?" Starbane laughed, because there was nowhere left to put the sound. "Because you are merciful. Because I am precise." The Stormlord did not raise his voice. "Waste is for the living. I have use for you." Two lichgard took Starbane by the arms with a gentleness that made him want to bite. Another knelt and pinned his right wrist to the stone with a dispersal plate that felt like a cold hand. A fourth blade hovered in the air, point down, as if asking a polite question of his bones. "Do it clean," Starbane said, and surprised himself with how tired he sounded. "Do not make it art." "Art?" A faint inflection, almost curiosity. "No, this is a sign." A blade fell. Pain is a language with no metaphors. It spoke in him until everything else had to shut up and listen. He watched his right hand hop once, absurd as a startled animal, and then lie still. Blood came out of him in a black ribbon that turned quickly to a red river when the air remembered what color ought to be. A Medicae reflex tried to tighten in his shoulders, and there was no Medicae, only a lichgard pressing a coagulant slab into the stump with the firmness of a man sealing a letter. Starbane's world narrowed to a ring of men who would not let him fall, and the slow approach of inevitability. Then that ring had too many holes in it to be a shape. Hands took his weapons away with the tender care of thieves who respect craft. A dispersion plane rolled him onto his back when he tried to rise, boots planted around him in a neat square that had all the warmth of a well-made box. He reached for the skein and found wire, cut ends, stubs that refused to braid, a song that had been turned to stuttering. They dragged the surviving cadre to the foot of the open seal like a fisherman pulling a stained net out of a cold sea. A few guardians on their knees, a reaper breathing through a whistle in his throat, a dragon missing a hand and trying to make a fist from habit, a ranger with one eye glued shut with the red and the other bright and hateful. They were herded into a tidy line by blade tips, and the kind of casual contempt only a practiced victor can afford. None begged. A few laughed. One coughed a laugh and spat something black on the floor and aimed his head like a gun at the Stormlord. The Pharaon did not speak first. He let the immortals settle into their resting stances, blasters politely lowered, and the lichgard adopt an artful square that framed the scene as if it were a fresco. When he moved, it was to tilt his chin that hair's breadth and consider the prisoners the way a collector considers pieces rescued from a fire. His hand described a small shape in the air. Mercy, but not compassion. Forgiveness, but only as a way to tidy a ledger. A lichgard stepped to the first kneeling guardian and gave him the gift of quickness. Blade down, neck parted, head bowed out of habit, then rolled. The second received the same courtesy. The third tried to rise and had his knee tacked to the floor by a neat thrust before the long cut. The Reaper got a beam instead, an immortal stepping in and writing a line through the sternum with that soft, dreadful hum. A dragon who had been nursing the ghost of a fist met a shield edge and then had no more work to do. The Ranger got the longest look, the Stormlord taking a fraction of a heartbeat to admire a thorn that had pricked him twice this day. Then the gesture, then the end, clean as law. Starbane remained, hauled upright by grips that might as well have been clamps. His breath fogged the inside of his helm with the quickness of fury and fear married. He fixed on the Stormlord and did not offer the insult of words that would not be heard. Imotekh studied him in the way a jeweler studies a flaw that makes a gem interesting. He lifted a finger and traced a vertical line in the air as if choosing a cut. Not yet, his eyes said. Not here. Your end must be work, not punctuation. They knocked Starbane to his knees gently, because gentleness is how you salt a humiliation. The floor under him was slick and cold, and full of echoes of men who had been better and worse than he, and all equally dead. A lichgard's blade hovered just above a carotid. The Pharaon lifted his hand minutely. The blade paused. The calculus had found a use that needed a living variable. The immortals broke line to collect the last trinkets from the wrecks and the bodies. Carefully, the way men clear a sanctum, they pretend not to understand. The lichgard finished the other accounts with swift, abstract motions until no one on the Aeldari side made noise useful enough to be called a voice. Heat bled from stones. Steam retreated into soft ropes. The particles' stink folded in on itself and made a film across the tongue. The chamber stilled. Beyond the seal, mechanisms muttered to themselves with the smugness of chores completed. Here and there, a plate pinged as it cooled, a small bright note in the vast wrongness. Drops fell from the high ribs and found blood and made little red galaxies. Weapons lay where hands had forgotten them, sights staring at nothing, muzzles beginning to look like mouths too tired to bite. A pathfinder's charm, a tiny hoop of wire and mica, spun once on the stone and lay flat. The tick of cooling armor took over the work of marking time. In that softness, Starbane stared up at the Stormlord and wished for one more clean mistake to exploit, and the Stormlord looked down as if composing an epigram that would be cruel and true and require no revision. They lined the dead with a tidiness that felt obscene. Blades finished what beams had begun, and the chamber's last voices shut off the way a machine stops when the hand is removed from the lever. Eldari Starbane knelt in the slick and made himself watch. He forced his eyes to stay open when a lichgard sword lifted and fell, when a guardian's head bowed out of habit an instant before the cut, when a ranger grinned with half a mouth and offered a curse before the blade put a period on him. He kept watching when a reaper's chest opened like a cupboard and the light inside went out. He counted, not to remember, but to deny the enemy, the luxury of being the only one doing arithmetic. When the last of his cadre sagged sideways and settled, the Stormlord moved with the consideration of a man choosing a tool. Immortals flanked him like brackets around a sentence that did not dare change meaning. The lichgard formed a square that could have been a frame for a painting of humiliation. The Pharaon's face had the patience of weather. He regarded Starbane the way a jeweler studies a flaw that makes a gem expensive. "Only you," Imotekh said, voice clean as a whetted edge. "Only you go on." "On?" Starbane laughed, because there was nowhere left to put the sound. "Because you are merciful." "Because I am precise." The Stormlord did not raise his voice. "Waste is for the living. I have use for you." Two lichgard took Starbane by the arms with a gentleness that made him want to bite. Another knelt and pinned his right wrist to the stone with a dispersal plate that felt like a cold hand. a fourth blade hovered in the air, point down, as if asking a polite question of his bones. "Do it clean," Starbane said, and surprised himself with how tired he sounded. "Do not make it art." "Art?" A faint inflection, almost curiosity. "No, this is a sign." A blade fell. Pain is a language with no metaphors. It spoke in him until everything else had to shut up and listen. He watched his right hand hop once, absurd as a startled animal, and then lie still. Blood came out of him in a black ribbon that turned quickly to a red river when the air remembered what color ought to be. A Medicae reflex tried to tighten in his shoulders, and there was no Medicae, only a lichgard pressing a coagulant slab into the stump with the firmness of a man sealing a letter. Starbane breathed and did not gift the room. A scream. He made his mouth work. "You will send me back like this?" "I will." Imotekh stepped closer, not so near that the Farseer could reach him even if he had two hands in a miracle, but near enough that the words would be personal. "You will carry my doctrine where I wish it heard. Order, unity, obedience. The Sortek does not persuade when it can demonstrate. Your craft world will understand demonstration." Starbane spat, and the spit came out as black string on the first try. "I will carry your name like a plague." "They will answer it with fire. They will answer it with caution." The Pharaoh cocked his head the width of a hair, that same elegant insult he had deployed all day. "Your kind are clever. Cleverness does not enjoy being reminded that corridors can be made to think. You will tell them this room. You will tell them the sound of their bones cooling. You will tell them that you reached for a retreat and found a wall. You will tell them you begged me for mercy and I granted it." "I did not beg. You did not need to." A thin pause, like the breath between a cut and the blood. "I desired it." He gestured. A Canoptek drone that had been hovering at the edge of the scene like a bored archivist glided forward and recorded the shape of Starbane's stump with a loving, clinical eye. It tugged a bright filament through the air and drew a neat sigil that meant alive, humiliated, useful. Another servitor picked up the severed hand between delicate claws and sealed it inside a crystal coffin the size of a helm. "Keep that," Imotekh said to no one in particular. Mounted with his weapon and his helm crest, make a story out of it. Things that look like trophies are easy to teach with. "Fuck your museum," Starbane whispered. "Language is for the living," the Stormlord said again, not unkindly. "And you, Aeldari Starbane, are very much alive." Orders moved like weather through the cohort. Recovery cycles began with the relief of a man sitting after a long stand. Immortals that had suffered dings and dents stepped backward into thin green doors and came forward whole again, the choreography smooth enough to insult grief. Scarab hives unrolled like fresh rugs and swept the basin, chewing metal slivers and bone shards, polishing the floor until it reflected the world badly. Canoptek wraiths drifted up from the stone to fish for booby charges with lazy elegance, plucking them, disarming them, setting them aside like dangerous toys taken from foolish children. The trap zone tidied itself. Quantum seals folded out of the air as if the room had decided it had entertained long enough. Vents shut their little mouths. The humming in the flagstones dropped away by polite increments until the teeth stopped noticing it. A cryptek stroked his staff, and the last of the false echoes on the perimeter died like light behind eyelids. The basin, still red where the scarabs had not yet supped, seemed to shrink under the pressure of that much order. Imotekh walked the scene as an accountant walks a ledger. He catalogued with his eyes and with little gestures that meant take, test, archive. Prisoners' blades were lifted with a care that made mockery more painful than contempt. Eldar helms were stacked, lenses outward, as if the collection were intended to watch its own captivity. A rune stone clattered to the floor from a corpse's hand. A Canoptek limb reached out and snatched it with sudden, greedy speed, and passed it to a Cryptek who made it go docile with a breath and a touch. Witch sight talismans went into lined trays. Pathfinder's charms in their wire and mica were pinned like butterflies, with notes about how long they took to stop glowing. A lichgard held up a Reaper launcher, whose frame a shard had tried to eat earlier. The Stormlord glanced once. "Keep the fragment adhered to it," he said. "Interesting reaction with the field. Someone will write a doctrine from it." He did not linger over the trophies. He did not preen. He did not boast. The work of victory is administration, and he did it with a competence that was insulting because it meant all this murder had been less a passion than a schedule. "Up," he said at last, and the square around him rotated like a precision tool. They lifted Starbane without letting him fall into either dignity or collapse, and they carried him as if he were dangerous glass. The march out was not a parade. It was a procession of inevitability. Lights softened as they passed, the tomb choosing a warmer register now that the guests had been entertained. Events exhaled a little thawed air. The stairs that had sneered on the way down were content now to be stairs again. In the corridors, Necron bodies that had been truly lost were already reconstituting their story. A warrior lay in two halves that tried to be whole. A swarm of needle-limbed Canoptek repairers crawled into the gap like ideas, stitched, soldered, sang in tiny voiceless harmonics, and the halves remembered how to want each other. A destroyer coil with a cruel burn still smoking rolled past on a floating cradle made of light, its caretakers fussing over it with the fussy affection of librarians dusting a rare spine. Phase doors sighed and forgave lateness. Damage reports unspooled into Cryptek hands in elegant glyphs. Schedules adjusted themselves to include triumph. They came to the mouth. The storm above had finally changed its mind. Clouds sagged as if tired of being told what to do. Lightning yawned itself short and went sulking off beyond the caldera's rim. The rain declined to fall. The sky found its color again, that iron not quite admitting to blue. The glass plane lay still with the patience of an old wound. The monolith's broken face cooled in wide slabs, and the stink of roasted oil thinned into a memory. Somonor's surface became what it had been before the voices. Quiet that is not peace, order that is not kindness. Sauron waited at the lip with his court arranged in a geometry of concessions. He might have been a statue dragged out to watch another statue's ceremony, save that the angle of his chin had the exact degree of pride a defeated king can still afford. He took in Starbane's stump without surprise, and the Stormlord's unsullied calm without envy. He did not bow far. He did not straighten quickly. He remembered how to be a sovereign, even while standing in the shadow of someone else's law. "Your world remains intact," Imotekh said, "because you were wise." "Because you were early," Sauron answered, the words creaking slightly with old courtesy. "Wisdom is rarely late." The Pharaon looked past him, over the glass, at the shapes of defense grids sketching themselves back into invisibility. "Formally, say it." Sauron turned to face his own legions, thin as they were, and the Sortek that had done their work with the ugly grace of inevitability. He spoke in the language of edicts, the tone that sets clocks and decides which sunrises are legal. Somonor binds itself to the Sortek. Law before pride, function before vanity. Your storm becomes our season. There was no cheer. Necrons do not cheer. Some closed processes, others opened them. The world adjusted itself by degrees. Standards showed new sigils, not because someone painted them, but because colors remembered what they had used to be. The tomb's heart beat on a fraction steadier. Vents exhaled approval. Imotekh inclined his head, that fraction which, in him, meant assent. "You will keep your throne. You will keep your registry. You will lose any habit you may have developed for hesitation. The dynasty prefers a soldier who errs with speed over one who cannot bring himself to sin." "I have no energy for sin," Sauron said dryly. only for survival. Gained. Then we will be friends, Imotekh said, and turned away before friendship could be mistaken for a conversation. The lichgard arranged the fascia at the foot of a black skimmer whose angles made human eyes miscount. A canoptech drone affixed an insignia to the whole with a ceremony that, to human sensibilities, would have looked like mockery. It was not. It was simply a stamp that meant he belongs to this story now. An immortal clipped a beacon to Starbane's harness and made sure the seal would broadcast until the craft cleared the tomb's shadow and then die with dignity. Go, Imotekh said. Take my weather with you in your mouth. Starbane stared at him. He wanted a clever line. He wanted prophecy. He wanted to curse in a way that would feel like a knife. He said only, "We are not done," and hated how small it sounded in the Caldera's throat. "You are not wrong," the Stormlord said, and that was somehow worse than mockery. They launched him under a sky that had decided to behave. The skimmer rose without drama, found the seam in the air that meant leave, and slipped along it, a black thought knifing for the craft world's jurisdiction. Inside the hull, Medicae firm itched while it held him together. The ache of absence grew teeth and learned to name them. Pride sat across from him and watched him bleed and did not offer a hand. Behind him, the caldera became still stone and clever ghosts. Canoptech drones mapped scorch and abrasion into a catalogue whose only title was victory. Scarabs finished their meal and tucked themselves into their grills like obedient vermin. The broken monolith sledged itself into a more dignified ruin. Phase gates called down the last bright ugliness. A few gorse coils muttered as they were tuned back to tidy evil. The trap sealed its doors with the satisfied little clicks of a host whose guests have finally taken the hint. The Stormlord stood until the skimmer was a dot, and then not even that. He did not wave. He did not turn his back. He let the wind decide when to lift the last ash and carry it off the lip into the bowl. Then he spoke to the air because he did not need an audience. Order, he said. Unity. Obedience. The words were not a motto. They were a promise written as an invoice. He pivoted to politics with the same ease with which he had pivoted to killing. Cryptex brought him slates. He saw. He approved. He revised. Garrison strengths, rotation timetables, awakening schedules for deeper shelves that had sulked too long. Saren's command chains meshed with Sortek doctrine like cogs that had been ground together in another age and found each other again. Patrol vectors redrew themselves to include a wider sky. A communications beam angled toward Mandragora with the lazy arrogance of a scepter pointed at a subject who already knew how to kneel. Their storm broke at last, properly. A long sigh dragged out of a sky that had been taught tricks. The light found the glass plane and made it into a sea that had forgotten waves. The towers of Somonor's outer works lifted like black teeth, and then chose to be only stone again. Silence laid a hand on everything and made it behave. In that calm, the Stormlord did what kings do when the slaughter is done and the accounts have been checked. He stood where the wind could speak to the plates on his face and mean nothing by it, and considered the next move not as blood, not even as spectacle, but as geometry. The board had changed shape. The Aeldari would be angrier now and more careful. Both were useful. He would teach them corridors in other places. He would remind them that storms can be called like dogs, and that some doors look like mercy until they bite. Below and behind, the tomb hummed on its new settings, satisfied, sanitized, secure. Above, a severed hand in a crystal coffin cooled with the rest of the day and waited to be mounted somewhere important. A small bright lesson with fingers the color of old vows. A caldera's light slid toward evening without ever admitting the sun was involved. The glass plane kept its stillness, a lake of patient scars. At the rim, Overlord Saren stood with the exact poise of a blade set upright on a whetstone, and did the one thing kings hate while armies watch. He spoke allegiance. The words were not loud because Necrons do not waste volume. They were accurate, as law is accurate when carved into stone. He named his tomb World Somonor, and named the Sortek, and named himself between them like a rivet hammered through iron plates. He fixed oath to function. He bowed exactly as much as a throne may bend without becoming a chair. Imotekh listened as a wall listens, measuring angles, finding load-bearing truths. When Sauron finished, the Stormlord inclined his head by the width of a breath and sealed the matter without flourish. The banners that had brooded along the Caldera's teeth changed colour without cloth, sigils like old stars combing themselves smooth, from local glyph work to the clean green geometry of Sortek claim. No trumpets, no theatrics. Ownership is a quiet thing when it is sure of itself. Without the dynasty, Sauron said, voice dry with old dust that no weather could wet, they would have scoured us to glass and memory. There is merit in being honest with arithmetic, Imotekh replied. He turned slightly, examining the skeletal vista of outworks and gate faces. You are a hinge. Hinges do not stay on their doors by pride. They walks the lit together, while cohorts reformed below into patterns that would have pleased any strategist who loved obedience. Canoptek constructs ghosted over the field like busy presences from a polite afterlife, sweeping, indexing, repairing the edges of reality where battle had frayed it. Immortals return from recall cycles with surfaces restored, bearing the indifference of tools oiled and stored correctly. A few destroyers idled on high crests, not scavenging, but thinking the long thoughts only predators can afford, coils cooling in thin blue breaths. Imotekh spoke his decisions in the crisp cadence of orders already written, garrison protocols unfurled. The Caldera would bristle, yes, but it would not waste bodies in melodrama. Picked immortal cadres would hold the inner ring where the geometry loved them most. The lichgard would rest in galleries 2 layers back, ready to make a sentence into a paragraph at the instant he chose. Death marks would be seeded in lattices on the upper slopes, to pluck a jet-bike arrogance before it could compose a daring story. Destroyer wings would rove along the ridges in pairs, never still, always drawing long lines in mines beyond the horizon. Canoptek networks, already thinning the red stink from stone, would be tasked to listen, not shout. Microquakes, thermal creep, psychic itch, anything that hinted at life planning impoliteness. Awakening schedules followed, revised with surgical contempt for local sentiment. Shelved warriors deep down in the cold rows would come awake in cohorts, not in the clumsy floods that waste minds on acclimatization. Protocols specified how many, how often, how long they would be allowed to be citizens, before they went back to being soldiers. Cryptex nodded, spines humming, eyes dimming and brightening in satisfaction as the numbers made pleasing music. But this was the kind of craft they loved best. Murder measured until it pleased mathematics. The Stormlord had a cryptek raise, a projection of maps. Ultima segmentum rolled up in cold light, star systems like pinheads hammered into a black anvil. He drew a neat box around the Vidar sector, traced arteries of traffic and appetite, pointed with a gauntlet at resource nodes that looked like nothing to outsiders, and like beating valves to men who had taught empires how to breathe. Somonor's value was not a glittering jewel, but an honest coin, a gate on a route, a fulcrum for force, an ugly necessity that makes prettier necessities possible. The box thickened, its edge crawling with active glyphs that meant Gar. Asset lists were recited out of the air itself, the tomb systems eager to please. Immortal cohorts. How many? Which of them preferred the drill wall, and which enjoyed a forward rake? Lichgard cadres, blades and shields tallied with watchmaker pride. Canoptek networks, nodes and subnodes, and whispering wraiths that loved stone. Destroyers that remained, their coils temper tracked like the moods of savage dogs. Death marks counted with chilly humor, nest locations shaded in with a cartographer's joy. Their losses were reviewed, not with grief, but with the contempt due to inefficiency, then folded into repair pledges and replacement drafts. "You retain local command," Imotekh said, and Zaren's chin lifted by a fraction that gave back some dignity to his plates. "Your voice holds here. Your decisions will conform to doctrine. Doctrine is simple. Order before vanity, unity before preference, obedience before habit. Your house will learn this. Your house will love this." "My house has survived by learning what it had to," Zaren said. There was no bitterness in it, only the dried-out dignity of someone who had outlived the use of bitter tastes. Sortek law is less heavy than extinction. Imotekh accepted the compliment he had not been given and kept moving. Communications beams speared outward like nails. Mandragora received and echoed, Crownworld running a hand over its long ledger and entering a neat line. Somonor secured, oath sworn, assets aligned, value affirmed. Protocols from the dynasty's heart flowed back down the stiffness of the beams. Signing keys, inspection rituals, inventory cadence, the anonymous care with which big machines adopt smaller ones that work. Below, reconstruction cycles took priority, the way a wound takes priority over an old scar. The broken face of the monolith would be repurposed as a slab to teach on, not replaced by a vain double. Gate mechanisms hummed through self-checks, then stood abashed at their own competence. Phase grids were annealed. Suppressor pylons took new mood readings from the air. The caldera's rim redistributed its teeth into shapes more welcoming to Gorse trajectories. Cryptek crews with too many hands and very still faces floated into galleries where impacts had torn geometry, extruded bright strings, pulled them tight, and sang soft harmonics until the stone remembered how to fit its own mask again. Imotekh requested a record of the battle as a tapestry of data. He did not enjoy it. He examined it. The nanoscarab surge was analyzed with pitiless affection. Swarm behavior across armor types, reaction times to sealants, heat tolerances set against Aeldari discipline curves. Adjustments were appended to be implemented as doctrine. Vent dispersion patterns, humming amplitude for peak panic inducement, kill haze density that pleased lichgard footwork instead of hindering it. The ceiling hunt was reviewed as theater and as science. Drop vectors against ring formations, the rate at which back-to-back knots stabilize, the cost of sharpening fear versus the cost of shaving numbers early. The immortal fusillades were laid along a graph measured in breath lengths and blood loss, friendly fire left as a flat line of contempt, uninterested in human squeamishness. Out of these came counters that would kill Aeldari faster next time. He lingered a shade longer on one small sequence. A ranger cell trying to make a knife out of a pillar's shadow and being turned into arithmetic by intersecting beams. He filed that for others to study, not with glee, but with a craftsman's correct pride. To teach an enemy a shape and then punish him for believing in it is an art. To codify that art into a drill is how dynasties last. Zaren moved among his soldiers while this happened. Not idle, not sharing in the mathematics, but placing hands against stone in proprietary ways, reacquainting himself with a house that had been humiliated and then spared. His courtiers stood with the rigid relief of men who have survived the lesson that was aimed beyond them. He paused by a death-marked nest and observed their calm with something like familial approval. If he had ever felt love, it would have been for tools that did exactly what they were built for, and nothing else. When he came back to the rim again, Sortek's sigils glowed on banners that used to pretend at local pride. He did not blink. "Your colors sit well on this world," he said, almost to himself. "Colors are for the living," Imotekh said, and then allowed himself a tiny concession to poetry. "But they help the dead find their duties. Then let them help. I will not argue with the shoe of an order I can obey." The formal confirmation took the length of an old sigh. Somonor's registry was stamped with a glyph that meant bound forever in a script no one living speaks. Mandragora's answer slid through a layer of atmosphere. and fell into a waiting lens with all the sentiment of a tax receipt. 2 cryptex touched staves, and the caldera's hum changed key by a hair, the way a chamber tunes itself when an organ is rolled in and set at the proper pitch. A final round of repair assignments flickered and flowed. The outer towers of braided faces would be smoothed and etched with new doctrine. The broken plains, where Shuriken and Gauss had taught each other's dialects, would be hardened against similar talk. Supply corridors inside the mountain would be widened so that shield wall and gun wall could trade places without asking permission. Tenoptic gardens would be planted deeper into the rock so that new swarms woke closer to mouths that deserved them. The trolls would begin at an hour that pleased the stone's temperature, and continue until years made them old rituals with ugly nicknames. Imotekh watched his instructions attach themselves to the world, the way barnacles grip a hoe, and called it enough for this day. He turned at last to face Sauron directly. The Stormlord's face had the expression he wore when reminding someone that a clean doctrine is a kindness. "You keep your throne," he said. "It sits under my law. I am not coming back to argue with you about tastes. If any old habit in this place decides to speak, you will silence it before it learns its own name. You will bar the door to Eldar, to thieves, to fools who think a tomb may be taught to negotiate. You will repair fast, you will awaken at pace, and if I call for spear or shield, you will answer whether or not you think you have the time." Sauron did not bristle because he had long ago mislaid the part of himself that could be insulted by truth. "You have given me a world instead of a story about a world. That is more than most kings give when they make families of strangers." "I am not most kings," Imotekh said, and the heir did not bother trying to disagree. They stood together a little longer in the winds that had learned humility. Beneath them the caldera wore its new order, the way a wound wears a tight bandage, ugly, necessary, dignified by function. The banners wore Sortek color with a brightness that admitted no argument. The tune's pulse was steady. The corridors below had stopped pretending to be anything but halls for obedience to march through. A final transmission went to Mandragora, not as poetry, but as ledger. Somonor, region Vidar, value enumerated as hinge and node, assets present and assets promised, awakening schedule, doctrinal corrections appended, likelihood of renewed Aeldari contact high, posture recommended, patience advised, contempt encouraged. The Crown World's response hummed back across space, old as Empire and just as tired. Acknowledged, integrated, proceed. The Stormlord allowed that to be the last word. They did not look after the skimmer that had borne Eldorath Starbane toward his craft world, though some kings would have. Mercy once given needs no audience. Instead, he put his hands behind his back and let the caldera's quiet explain the future to itself. Somonor had been a rumor. Now it was a law. The dynasty had one more hinge set right. The season of Sortek stretched its shadow across another throat. When they left the rim, the plates underfoot were already re-etching themselves with new routes for patrol, tiny lips of stone opening and closing to test fresh airflows. Scarabs slipped into sleeps that were really promises. Wraiths wrote elegant signatures into the walls where only they would ever read them. Somewhere, deep in ordered dark, shelves shivered with the prospect of waking in proper sequence. On the surface, the banners moved in a breeze that existed chiefly so the colors would have something to do. The skimmer cut out of the storm's throat and slid into the patient lanes of a lighthawk, like a guilty thought returning to a house where the walls remember. Wraithbone towers leaned in, listening with the tact of ancient trees. At the dock spines, helms turned and then turned away again, because pity is bad manners in a warrior city. Eldorath Starbane stepped down with foam dried stiff into the bandages at his right wrist and the old grace still in his back, because if the body limps, the will does not have to. He did not cover the stump, he let the shame breathe. He wanted it to smell the craft world and promise it would grow teeth. Wraithguards stood with their silent faces and made a lane. Guardians bowed the thickness of a sigh and did not meet his eyes. A ranger captain, coat dusted with long roads, touched 2 fingers to the brow in that old rude salute and said nothing, because any word would have to be either lie or kindness. The air tasted of resin and storm ghosts, the afterbite of lightning carried on from somewhere a lifetime away. Starbane walked with his left hand open and his right wrapped, each step counting a name without saying it. He refused a litter. He refused a sling. He kept the harness that stank of Somonor's stone and the close breath of dead men, because it had a lesson trapped in the fabric, and he would not dare to wash it out. The chamber of eternal starlight convened as he crossed its threshold, runic constellations kindling above a floor that remembers every boot. In that bowl of pale radiance, the seer council settled like weaponry on display, so still the air had to choose progress on purpose. Their helms were off, which is how you know you are either loved or judged. Elders, old enough to have watched whole styles of death go out of fashion, waited under a ceiling that breathed the infinity circuit's soft thunder. Starbane stopped in the circle where petitioners and heroes stand, and enemies sometimes kneel. He set his empty sleeve at his side and held his chin level and wished his breath would not fork his ribs like a cheap mirror. "Speak," said the eldest voice, not unkind, but without a place to sit down in it. He did not try to gild it. He gave them the bones, with the meat still on, because making it neat would have been a vanity he had not earned. He told them of the sky that learned obedience, of the storm called like a dog. He told them of the gates sighing open, and of the enemy falling back in order so crisp it threw pride into error like a fishbone. He told them how the labyrinth leaned a man without letting him feel it. He named the quantum seals that closed with a light you could not see until the shot came back crooked. He described the blood that arrived as dust and learned to bite in every seam it could taste, the nanoscarabs that went in humming and came out black with what used to be brothers. He related the ceiling hunt, flayed nightmares dropping like a second weather, claws singing, masks grinning in old stolen shapes. He left nothing soft. He did not pretend courage could make geometry change its mood. The immortals advanced in measured cruelty, he said, and the words came out calm only because the throat remembers drill even when the heart is clawing. Their beams wrote our names into the floor. Lichgard sealed the work like a judge drawing a line under a page. The hedgehog that kept knives honest became a feast for long guns. Cohesion disintegrated under a music that never faltered. Pockets of us died as if a book were being closed. They left me to carry the arithmetic home. He lifted the rat stump and let it wag in the cold light. I sent this as a footnote. No one made a sound while he spoke of the hand and what it had cost not to scream. If any wanted to speak pity, the chamber would not have let them. Pity is for after sleep. The reality now weighed more than sympathy can lift. A younger warlock, all sharp angles and eyes that had not yet lost their softness for beautiful lies, said through his teeth, "You chase them into a house that writes the law of its rooms as you walk them." Why? Because if a mouth opens you either back away like prey or you put your fist down its throat until it chokes on you, Starbane said, and did not dress it. Because we judged the stasis cough would keep the corpse from sitting up before the cut was made. Because speed is what we are good at, and patience is a ritual we practice only to prove we can. Because they made the retreat look like fear, and in that we are no better than Monday K with their pretty courage. Because the storm took our angles, and I mistook faith in angles for faith in fate. Choose any of these wise. They all end the same. "But what is the count?" asked an elder, whose face had long ago chosen to be a weapon. He spoke the number in the way you speak, a heresy you cannot deny. An entire war host burned down to cauterize stumps in one campaign inside one mouth. Aspect shrines bled white. Guardian lists that would have filled a wall now fit in an elderly priest's tired hands. The aerial arm was a whisper. The spear claws were short. The reaper's racks were thin and ashamed. The names he laid at their feet did not echo. Names do not echo in that chamber. They sit like stones. You live, a counselor said, neutral, testing for rot. I was made into a living sign, he answered, with acid he did not bother to hide. The Stormlord wanted this room to hear a voice with breath, telling you not merely that you lost, but how, and by whose law, and that our cleverness is admired enough to be humiliated properly. He is not inert. He is not disorganized. Imotekh is a doctrine that wears a king like a gauntlet. It does not sleep. It does not come apart when you beat on it. It writes corridors, and then calls weather, and then argues with math until math comes around to its taste. If you expect an automaton's stupidity, you will die educated. One of the older seers cut a glance to the side, as if tasting the song of the infinity circuit for the gall of such a thing. We have faced dynasts content to sit in dirt and call judgment progeny. You tell us this one is a builder. I tell you he values function over vanity and believes that obedience is cleaner than inspiration, Starbane said. He tore the war out of the air and set it into halls. He chose where our courage would be useless. He had the patience to let us think we were clever, and the cruelty to teach us that cleverness without humility is a throat. He sent me back because humiliation travels faster than news. He sent me back because a message heard in our own tongue cuts deeper than any glyph he can broadcast at us. The council let the taste of that sit. Then the eldest asked for the lessons, as if blackboards hung inside all their skulls and chalk could still scratch there over the cracks. Starbane gave them without ornament. Do not chase a Necron into the labyrinth. If the mouth grins at you, you break the teeth from outside, or you do not break them at all. Never cede maneuver to anything that writes its own ground. Make it fly, make it run, force it into air, into open, into anything with sky above it and space around it. Do not let it call weather and then dignify the weather by fighting under it. If visibility is stolen, preserve distance and reserve blood. If a corridor is a kindness, it is a trap. If a corner breathes, you burn it. Nanoscarabs are not a trick, they are a doctrine. Seal every seam until the idea of an opening makes you angry. Flayed ones are not terror, they are a plan. Walls and back-to-back knots can hold their first verse. Their chorus will be long guns. When the enemy shapes you into a hedgehog, you have already paid the next bill. Do you expect forgiveness? Asked a warlock, who sounded like a blade being held in a cold hand. I expect penance, Starbane said. In work, in wounds, in doctrine. I expect to wear this shame until it stops glowing and leaves a scar that knows its name. He looked down at the bandages and then back up at the ring of elder faces. And I expect you to harden everything we are, until when we meet that dynasty again, we bring the right knives to the right house. The chamber absorbed the magnitude the way a glacier takes fire, slowly, without changing shape on the surface. Underneath, something shifted. The loss was not a number. It was shrines thinned to thinness, pilots without wings, reapers' racks half empty, and lovers waiting in halls that now held one less set of footsteps. It was the craft world itself, turning its head and counting, and then looking at its gardens and its engines, and deciding which would have to be quiet so that other things could be loud. An entire war host gone is not a whole. It is an absence that bends every map. Humiliation burned clean. That is its only merit. It burned the fat from pride and left a hunger with a shape. One of the oldest among them, whose face had learned the economy of violence, said the thing that could not be left unsaid. Redress. Redress, the council echoed, a prayer because it needed to be a decision at the same time. Starbane let the word wash him and leave grit. You will be tempted to call other craft worlds and turn this into a lesson writ large, perhaps later. For now we study a single signature. Imotekh does not scatter. It does not forget. It holds a crown world like a fist holds a stone. Mandragora is the heart that teaches the hands. I will not mouth foolishness about spearing a sun, but there are arteries, there are tendons. There are nerves we can touch with cold fingers. They lifted projections and wrote with light. The Vidar roots he had seen through a Necron's contempt were now in Aeldari blue, familiar, fixed to roads their own ships loved. They carved out shadow corridors in the void where Necron patrols fly straight and fast and arrogant. They shaded nodes the dynasty must feed because empires starve when they forget how to count. They circled places not pretty enough to be guarded with banners, but too important to be left to obedient dust. Reaper elders spoke in the slow, precise tones of mathematicians discussing weather, and a dragon exarch with ash in the seams of his armor laid out the breath lengths of melter sermons in void, and on cliff and inside the ribcage of a dead station that could be warmed back up just enough to look inviting. Never again a chase down a throat, an elder said, more to the air than to him. We make them blink under open stars. We press from angles that cannot be turned into corridors. We goad their destroyers into fighting where their recall rooms are arrogant enough to show seams. Starbane's flat smile had teeth. We put death marks in doubt. We teach their staircases what a collapse feels like. We set their perfect weather against itself and time our strikes for when the storm thinks it is on our side. We write a doctrine that forces their king to choose between patience and bleeding, and when he bleeds, we do not lick our lips, we cut harder. Your survival, said the quietest voice in the chamber, is understood as cruelty calculated to travel faster than any glyph. It has arrived on time. D&I. Then spend me, Starbane said. If I am a lesson, let me fucking teach. Silence folded over that with the respect due to an oath. And no one applauded, no one bowed. The chamber is not a theatre. It kept breathing, that hum that belongs to elders and dead and ships. Finally the elder spoke, as if he were pushing a heavy door. Would begin assembling the pieces, he said, not banners, instruments. We quiet the gardens and wake the hangers. We move coins from beauty to function. We ask shrines what they can give without breaking. We speak to outworlds who owe us debts. We sharpen. Slowly, correctly, the way you sharpen an old blade so the edge does not shiver off in its first cut. A ranger slipped away while light maps changed shape, already drawing routes along void dust and cold rock. Warlocks turned their palms up and let the skeins pour over their hands like cold water, watching for lines that did not kink under Necron interference. Bonezingers frowned and set lathes singing in new keys. Guardians trudged toward armories where boredom had been murdered and replaced with tasks. Dragon halls murmured as canisters were weighed and seals tested, and little old prayers misremembered by muscle were corrected. The Reaper sergeants walked the rows and counted with the affection one has for tools that will break you if you lie to them. Starbane stood alone within the circle when the maps were done moving and the orders had grown feathers and flown. He looked down at the stump as if it had spoken, and then up at the chamber's ceiling where the stars were arranged according to the craft world's opinion of truth. He whispered, because it was safe to be small for a breath, I will not let that be the last story I tell here. A runner approached, stopped, bowed, and delivered a tally of replacements that had not yet learned to be ashamed of being replacements. It was inadequate and honest. Starbane nodded. We will make do, he said. We will make worse than do. We will make them learn our names in the language of their ledgers. He left the chamber to the murmuring of elders and the scrape of stones moving on maps. In the corridor, the ranger captain, who had said nothing at the dock, fell into step. You look like you have a bad idea, the captain said. I have a good one that wants to wear a bad idea's coat, Starbane said. We are going to borrow patience from people who do not like to lend. Fuck, the captain said, admiring. We are going to live long enough to hate this. If we are lucky, Starbane said, and in that little laugh was the entire weight of a craft world that had just learned it could bleed out and still plan vengeance, as if planning were breath. The walk back to the docks was longer than it had been coming in, and in the quiet behind his teeth, the Farseer promised himself he would keep count better next time, that he would murder his own pride before it could put knives in other men's hands, that when the Stormlord called weather again, the sky would remember whose song it had sung first. Imotekh stopped speaking Somonor's name aloud, not because it was forbidden, but because every time it touched a tongue, the air seemed to weigh more. The craft world pivoted, like a blade being reversed in the hand. Charts that had been crowded with a single wounded star were cleared, and new lights were kindled deeper into Imotekh dark. The mandragora grew in the augury like an iron heart under frost. Archery routes threaded out of it, patient, efficient, too clean. Rangers stared at those lines the way hunters stare at prints left in snow and say, "There, there, there." Intelligence did not chase rumors. It stalked habits. Pathfinders slipped into cold systems and watched the way patrols drew their nets. They counted the time it took a destroyer wing to circle back to its comfort, tasted the faint brass tang of teleport residue on derelict hulls that had been touched and then scorned. In the halls of the Seers, runes clinked against the wraithbone and lay in patterns that matched the Ranger's maps with a nasty neatness. The Imotekh preferred straight lines and obedient tempos. Straight lines can be broken. Tempos can be made to stumble. Doctrines were rewritten with the vicious care of surgeons cutting old flesh from a healing wound. A monolith and addiction went to the top of the slate. No more clean wedges racing across polite killing bowls. No more letting a door decide where the throat is. The bone singers fashioned anchor spikes from wraithbone and tempered glass steel, meant to bite and hold even when a slab stepped in with the insolence of elsewhere. Teams drilled in the ugly ballet. Vipers dragging anchor lines, serpents slamming spikes with grave weight, dragons stepping in under humming dispersion, veils to lay charges where Livingstone is shy. Every exercise ended with a mock teleport shunt that would have stolen men into emptiness. They ran it again until nobody flinched when the floor tried to become a sky. Deathmark counters were inked in bitter lines, no more trusting the elegant purity of a sight picture. Veils were woven from mirror shards and rune film, throwing a hunter's redder finger's width to the side. Pathfinders learned to braid their lanes so that any angle inviting enough to be fatal was also a snare. The shot would come, and a second and third would cross it. A heartbeat later, not at the target, but at the space the killer's head would slip into when it leaned for pride. Jetbike pilots stopped drawing pretty curves along rim lines and learned to write their speed in stutters with gaps, exactly where a patient assassin expected smoothness. They cursed every lesson and loved them for how ugly they made survival. The nano-scarab protocol became scripture. Foam seals were no longer equipment, but sacraments. Guardians drilled with bare arms under glass, until the feeling of 1,000 pin teeth crawling could be replicated in the mind without the actual sin of letting the things loose. Imotekh barked in the cadence of executioners. If it climbs inside your elbow, cut the sleeve, foam, bind, move. If it finds the back of your knee, do not kneel, melt and stamp. If it finds your neck, you call a name, and someone else does it, because heroes who try to be surgeons with their own throats make good ghosts and bad doctrine. A dragon sergeant paced the line and growled. If it hums under the skin, you burn the skin. I do not care how pretty you were before this drill. No one laughed. They did not need to be told again. Anti-flayed, one drills, deserved their own weather. Halls were darkened to the same green hush as the tomb and smeared with grease until footing went treacherous. Cruel proxies dropped from whisper rails with no warning, while klaxons remained silent, because silence had been the enemy's favorite music. The knots formed, broke, formed again. Back to back became the way hands breathed. Every time a blade found a seam, the crews learned which curse steadied fingers and which made them fumble. Dragons practiced half-length flames so the heat would kill without cooking their brothers. Reapers shut off the part of the soul that admires perfect arcs and learned to kiss a pouncing silhouette with a round that would not put shrapnel in a friend's lung. At the end of each hour, a master of the drill walked the line and shook harness points. Loose meant death. Every buckle learned to be ashamed of slack. Fleet redeployment turned from art into arithmetic without losing all its grace. The void arm was rethreaded around the problem of destroyer batteries and Gauss lattices. No more broadside heroics against a line that pretended not to care about damage while it laced space into green cages. Raiders were assigned in 3s and 4s, each not able to fake a retreat, not because retreat is noble, but because it is a mouth that bites when the pursuer leans too far. Fire prisons were given the insult of patience and told to hold lances until the second pulse knitted the lattice wrong. Falcons got new skin turns shaped to foul the neat calculus of Soutech rangefinders. Wave serpents had their shields tuned in unfriendly keys, so a gore stitch would find its hum faltering at the wrong microsecond. On the briefing floor, a pilot scraped a boot and said, "We are not going to win a wrestling match in a green net," and the flightmaster nodded and said, "No, we are going to cheat so hard the net thinks it forgot how to be a net." Psychic caution was inked over every plan, as if the ink could weigh the paper down. Warlocks were given humility like a ration. The skein had tastes the tomb could spoil, and anyone who stuck a hand in it without a leash would come back with teeth marks or not at all. Seers set limits the way you set traps for yourself. You do not extend will beyond the wall of your shield if the wall is conversational. You do not trust a corridor that flickers when you blink. You do not try to debate with a field that bends shots into pretty curves. If a vision shows you a clean kill inside a machine's bones, assume you are seeing what the machine wants to see in you. The youngest among them muttered that this smelled like cowardice. The elders replied, "Call it survival and argue later when you have the breath." The dead of Somonor were mourned in a ritual that made silence into a weapon. The names were not shouted. They were placed stone by stone along a wraithbone rail that runs the length of a hall older than any fleet and will outlive any grudge. In the alcoves, helms were set facing inward as if keeping watch on those who would come to learn. Bone singers walked among the objects returned from the tomb and touched them with the gentleness of craftsmen examining broken tools, not relics. The pain of it became doctrine in that same breath. A guardian's battered shield hung on a hook with a note, "Do not bow under long fire, bow and you die." A dragon's scorched nozzle held a smear of clotted metal. Underneath, in ink, the ugly truth, "Love your heat less." A reaper's launcher with a bite taken out of its frame sat under a shard pinned with the caption, "The room eats weapons, keep them meaner than rooms." Cincher found Starbane in exactly the measure necessary to keep his spine angry and his head cold. In the Chamber of Eternal, Starlight elders and juniors alike took their turns at him. He did not argue when they named the pride that had believed speed could bully geometry. He did not argue when they called his chase a throat swallowed. He did not argue when they said the dynasty had made a sign out of him, and he had abetted the lesson by breathing. When they were finished, he asked for work instead of forgiveness. They gave it. Resolve is a kind of mercy. Industry turned its face to war with the old weary affection that lovers share when they have outlived romance and kept something better. Bone singers sang new veining into wraithbone spines that would wear engines and guns with less complaint. Forges hammered coil housings to shapes that would shrug off a Gauss lick a fraction longer. Aspect shrines opened doors and counted not how many souls were eager, but how many had hands that could learn new cruelties. guardians lined for distributions that smelled of oil and old oaths. In assembly vaults, serpents grew like sharks in glass wombs, while craft priests read off lists of parts in tones that made the words into prayers, even when no one wanted prayers. The seer council wrote the long road in low voices that treated patience like a friend who eats too much but always brings a bottle worth opening. This would not be a raid to wash and honor clean. This would be seasons of cutting tendons thin enough that they would not be felt until a limb failed. Routes into the vidar arteries were chosen that looked nothing like roots. Forward assets were placed where an accountant would call them waste and a poet would call them seeds. A dozen small, vicious doctrines were stamped hard, to be taught until they tasted like instinct. Never let a corridor tell you where your feet should go. Never let a storm choose your sky. Never worship momentum. Never assume an enemy who smiles at doctrine has forgotten how to improvise better than you. Starbane took those orders and shaped them into knives others could hold without slicing themselves. He walked the hangars and the shrines and the practice pits where men practiced killing shadows that had learned how to smile, and he said little and listened more. When a dragon cursed the way the new protocol made fire feel stingy, he said, "Hold it back until you hate me, then kiss clean and short." When a ranger complained that the mirror veils made aim feel dishonest, he said, "Good, honesty almost killed you." When a pilot spat that avoiding lattice nets would turn art into stutter, he said, "Then stutter beautifully and live." At night, if the craft world could be said to have knights, he went alone to the hall where the names sat like bright pebbles along the rail. He ran his left hand over them because his right could not, and he remembered each face in the order the names asked for, not the order his guilt wanted. He told them what had been done that day and what would be done the next. He did not ask for blessing. He did not deserve it. He asked only that they wait to see their doctrine walk in other halls. On the docks where the void speaks a different grammar, a Viper flight chief clapped a hand on a pilot's shoulder and said, "Keep it ragged. Smooth is how you die to green math." A Reaper sergeant shoved a lungs tube into a recruit's chest hard enough to bruise and said, "Learn to love ugly shots." A guardian cinched a foam seal until the skin beneath went white and said, "Pain now, or funeral later, pick." A warlock set a rune on a table and stared until it cooled. He murmured, "We are not here to win arguments with machines," and someone snorted and said, "We are here to break them and run." When the Pathfinders lifted for the dark beyond Vidar with their holds empty and their eyes full, the craft world did not cheer. It breathed out like a man who has remembered how to fight for a long time. The path ahead was not a single bright stroke, but a braid of cuts. Each small, each vicious, each designed to remind a dynasty that order is not a shield against contempt. Somewhere far off, Mandragora turned in its law, ignorant of the new weather being called against it by hands that had learned humility, the way a burn teaches respect. The long road had begun. It would not end with a banner hung in a throne room. It would end, if the gods cared to smile honestly for once, with a pause in the ledger where a king had expected a certainty and found a hole the size of a craft world's patience. He did not keep books. He kept laws. The ledger lived in plates and protocols and in the cold muscle memory of a dynasty taught to obey itself. Imotekh stood at the caldera's lip while the wind remembered how to move without orders and wrote Somonor into that ledger as both victory and lesson. Guile above endurance, patience above appetite. If some kings preferred to tally kills like coins, the Stormlord counted corrected habits and futures that had been forced to kneel. The tomb below had finished its tidying. Scarabs slept in their grills like obedient vermin. Wraiths left elegant signatures in stone, only they would ever read. Quantum seals kissed their frames and went quiet. Overlord Saren's oath still hung in the air like a note a cathedral sustains after the choir stops. Useful, required. With the oath, The world became hinge and node in the Vidar routes he had redrawn in his mind before his court put light to them. Somonor was now a function. Functions outlast banners. He dictated to no scribe, but cryptex nearby felt the shape of his thoughts and gave them symbols. Deny, Aeldari maneuver. That line hardened first. Make them exchange sky for ceiling, lanes for corridors, choice for choreography. The storm had done its polite work of smearing angles and dulling intuition. The retreat had baited the Farseer's pride until it called itself momentum. The labyrinth had leaned men without letting them feel the hand. Then the room had closed. The sequence endured. Nano-scarab swarms to turn arrogance into itch and itch into screaming. Flayer packs to teach hedgehogs humility. Immortal fusillades to make a sermon of attrition. Lichgard to draw the final line with shield and rule. Everything else was garnish. He allowed himself a precise moment to admire the cleverness of the enemy who had made the slaughter expensive. The dragons had burned a door that did not want to admit to being a door. The pathfinders had named angles worth fearing. Some of the reapers had done mathematics at a speed he respected. He fixed their efficiencies to the margin of the ledger, so the lessons would not go soft in retelling. Respect does not preclude contempt. Contempt requires accuracy, or it becomes vanity, and vanity is a crack. Political notes settled into place with the bored elegance of inevitability. Sauron secured, throne retained under law, local command speaking Imotekh doctrine without accent. The green geometry unfurled across the Vidar sector, modest, sure. Patrol schedules flowed outward like arteries, each beat measured in response time rather than pride. Mandragora's beam acknowledged receipt. Crown World adding Somonor to the dynasty's quiet litany of possessions brought back into the season. But no fanfare. Kings do not congratulate themselves for remembering what belongs to them. Their propaganda value was a separate column with no poetry. Aeldari humbled. A living herald sent back empty-handed, not metaphor. He pictured the hand cooling in its crystal coffin, paired with helm crest and pistol, in a display that would be both archive and warning. That relic would teach at least as well on his side of the void as the maimed Farseer would teach on his. When a civilization that worships elegance is forced to look at a stump, doctrine sharpens. The cavalry lines wrote themselves because the tomb likes order, and order likes to be seen doing its job. Regeneration circuits hummed through their cycles until scuffs became polish and dents forgot they had been struck. Retrieval teleporters had behaved as designed. Damaged cohorts whisked backward on command and returned trimmed of error. A few coils sulked. They would be annealed and flattered. The broken monolith would not be replaced, not yet. He would have the cracked face set as a teaching stone in a practice hall, so that cohorts walking past understood what happens to slabs that allow themselves to be admired for the wrong reasons. The forecast column sat like a blade across the page. Further Aeldari strikes expected. He trusted them to be stubborn and offended in equal measure. He trusted them to bring new rituals and uglier surprises. He wanted them that way. Lazy enemies make for lazy soldiers. Dynasty heartlands would be told to behave accordingly. Mandragora's shields would be tuned against elegant trespass, not brutish crashes. Picket nets would learn to breathe around ranger cleverness. Any corridor that tolerated beauty would be punished until it learned simplicity again. Standing orders followed like ribs along a spine. Reinforce gate complexes. Double quantum grid redundancies and stagger them so a single clever breach does not teach the rest bad habits. Retune environmental manipulation systems to smear Auspex and Witch Sight more quickly. The storm had been punctual, but he wanted it eager. Improve false echo protocols. Spent coils staged as theatre. Heat plumes piped into halls. Men are proud to choose. Microquakes cued to keep quick feet honest. Canoptic choirs would keep the amplitude hymn ready for 1,000 rooms, not just this one. Never again a single trap made famous by victory. Fame breeds countermeasures. Assets warranted their own review. Death marks would be drilled against mirror veils and spiteful stutter speed. Patience is their virtue. Pride is their leak. Teach them to lie to their own crosshairs and like it. Heavy destroyers would disperse differently on bowls like this, not making long, gorgeous lines for dark reapers to envy and unmake, but writing awkward lattices that hurt the eye and slow the hand. Doctrine the monolith. Interdiction and withdrawal would tighten until slabs learned to appear, disrupt, and depart before melter sermons could find the right corner to preach at. If a door insists on being admired, it may not be a door worth summoning. Better two dull slabs in discordant places than one beautiful one dying correctly. He let the memory of the immortal advance run again, frame by frame, the beams walking as they had been taught. Some few recall cycles had lagged under the load. The cryptechs were already writing apologies into parts orders and then crossing the apologies out. Lichgard had performed as they always did, like punctuation made steel. He ordered small refinements to their dispersion planes so that heat tongues kissed differently and learned despair earlier. When a blade's work becomes too graceful, it invites art, and art invites error. He would keep their kill ugly. Cultural codex entries were not his habit, but empires cohere on stories as much as on rails. He had a cryptech elevate the engagement to an exemplar in the Sortek annals under a title not meant for ears outside the dynasty. The Siege of Somnore would be recited to cohorts during maintenance rotations, not as myth, but as drill. The verses would name the sequence until men could rifle it in their sleep, could smell which room in which wall they were standing in whenever a mouth opened in a wall. The recital would include the cost. The legions that forget to count become decorations in other people's stories. He turned from the count era and walked while orders propagated through systems that did not need to be told twice. The ledger followed him because it lived in his gait. Cryptechs peeled away to seed their changes like gardeners with ugly flowers. Lichgard matched his pace with the silent assurance of men who know they will be asked to be a wall again and will not be found wanting. Immortals returned to galleries that loved their weight. Warriors deep down stirred from shelves, woke to duty, and were permitted the brief luxury of remembering they once had names before names became duty again. There was an outreach to make, the sort that pleases the crown world and keeps lesser thrones tidy. Mandragora would receive a transmission shaped like a report and like a sermon. Somonor secured, oath sworn, assets aligned, engagements catalogued, counters refined, doctrine improved, morale data favorable, propaganda value realized, expectation of Aeldari reprisal high, readiness increasing. The return would be brief, as always, acknowledged, integrated, proceed. He liked that about the crown world. It wasted nothing, not even approval. The Stormlord paused where the two-mouth had yawned, and now only breathed like any well-mannered door. He considered sending work crews to polish away the last of the melted sigils the dragons had written into the face, then chose to leave a few scars visible. Scars simplify instruction. A warrior sees a burn and learns where not to stand. A cryptech sees a seam and writes a better seam. Even the wraiths drifting through the stern would read the jagged edges like marginalia and adjust the harmonics of their passage accordingly. He tasted the air and smelled nothing of fear, which was proper. The world was quiet, not with peace, but with completion. He put a hand behind his back, the other behind that, the posture of a judge between sessions. The ledger did not require ink to close. It required a door to shut and a mind to remember which rooms still needed locks. The curtain for this campaign came down with no theatre. Somonor remained Sortek. That sentence would stand until someone earned the right to scratch at it. The war with Imotekh would move elsewhere, and he would prefer it that way. Battles repeated in the same rooms encouraged both sides to lie to themselves about understanding. He allowed himself a single thought that could almost have been called satisfaction. The Farseer would be standing under a ceiling that pretends to be the night, telling a council what corridors feel like when they think for themselves. He would be naming storms as tricks, and rooms as jaws, and pride as a blade turned against the hand that holds it. He would be useful. Rage, traveling faster than ships, is still a courier, and the message it brings makes men react on schedule. Imotekh descended into the tomb again because kings who prefer ledgers to laurels always go back down to look at the foundations. He passed warriors smoothing corners with their feet, and servitors snipping stumps from cable looms, and cryptecs arguing very quietly with staves over a fraction of amplitude in a hum the living would not notice until it touched their teeth. He stood at the edge of the basin where the red had been and saw only his reflection slightly wrong. Good, let the world below keep a little of the lie. Lies are tools when only one hand holds them. Before he left the chamber, he traced, with 2 fingers, a path from the far exit to the near one, through the places where the fields had shimmered and the vents had learned hunger. If he had been a poet, he would have called it a blessing. He was not. He was a man who pushed other men through the shapes he liked and punished any shape that learned to like itself. He turned away. Above, banners in Saltec colour moved in a wind that had finally been forgiven. The court fell in, elegant, mute. Orders were already a day old in systems that did not keep days, only cycles and purpose. The ledger closed, not with a snap, but with the quiet of a book placed properly on a shelf in a library that will outlast suns. Behind the cover, notes waited for an enemy who would come again because he had been taught to, and for a dynasty that would be ready because it could not be anything else.